Section 1. The World That Never Was. Pre-war America and the Road to Ruin. Picture this. The year is 2077. You're standing on a street in Boston, Massachusetts, and all around you the world looks like a fever dream of mid-century America frozen in amber. The cars parked along the curb run on nuclear fusion. The robots puttering around in diners and shops are sleek, cheerful, and just slightly unsettling in the way that only things trying very hard to seem friendly ever are. The music playing from a nearby bar is some crooning big band number that sounds like it belongs in 1955, and the advertisements plastered across every surface promise a bright and shining future of limitless atomic energy, suburban prosperity, and a gleaming tomorrow just around the corner. Except the tomorrow that's actually around the corner is the end of the world. That is the heart of what makes Fallout's universe so fascinating and so deeply strange. It is not our future. It never was. The moment you step into any of these games, you're stepping into an alternate history, one that split from our own sometime after World War II and never looked back. In our world, the late 20th century brought us transistors, microchips, personal computers, the internet, and eventually pocket-sized devices with more computing power than anything that existed in the 1960s. In Fallout's world, none of that happened. Instead, the world doubled down on nuclear power. Everything became atomic. Cars were powered by small nuclear reactors. Robots became a commercial reality. Artificial intelligence progressed in ways that our own timeline took entirely different routes toward. But for all that technological firepower, the culture simply didn't move. Socially, philosophically, aesthetically, the world got stuck somewhere around 1955 and stayed there. This is a very deliberate piece of world building, and understanding it is essential to understanding everything else that follows. The retrofuturism isn't just an aesthetic choice. It's a statement about what happens to societies under constant existential pressure. When resources became scarce and the global order began to fracture, the United States didn't evolve into some sleek utopia. It calcified. It became more conservative, more paranoid, more obsessed with the idea of a perfect domestic life, even as the world outside began to crumble. The cheerful propaganda, the bright colors, the smiling vault boy giving a thumbs up while mushroom clouds bloom behind him. All of it is the face that a society in deep denial puts on for the world. So how did the divergence actually happen? The games are deliberately vague on the specific moment, but the general shape is clear. In the years following the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union began their familiar Cold War dance, but in Fallout's world, the Soviet Union eventually collapsed or receded as a major player earlier than in our timeline. China emerged as the primary rival superpower, and the ideological conflict that defined the 20th century became a Sino-American one rather than a Soviet-American one. The paranoia about communist infiltration that gripped America in the real world during the 1950s found a new and very specific target in Fallout. And Chinese spies, saboteurs, and submarines haunted the nightmares of pre-war America in ways that shaped its politics, its culture, and ultimately its fate. The critical thread running through all of this is oil. By the mid-21st century in Fallout's world, the planet's petroleum reserves were running critically, disastrously low. This wasn't gradual, it was catastrophic. The resource wars, as they came to be known, began around 2052 when the European Commonwealth dissolved into a collection of fractious, desperate nation states, all fighting over the remaining energy supplies. The Middle East, always a flashpoint, became an inferno, and the United States and China began circling each other with increasing hostility over the last significant fossil fuel and uranium reserves on the planet. In 2066, China made a move that would define everything. Chinese forces invaded Alaska, beginning what history would record as the Battle of Anchorage. Alaska's oil pipeline was one of the most strategically important pieces of infrastructure on the continent, and China calculated that controlling it might be decisive in the resource war. The United States responded with everything it had, and for over a decade, the frozen mountains and tundra of Alaska became the site of a grinding, brutal military conflict that bled both nations dry. American soldiers fought in experimental power armor, technology so advanced it gave individual soldiers the combat capability of small tanks. The T-45 and T-51 power armor models deployed at Anchorage were cutting-edge pieces of military hardware, and their existence tells you everything about how differently technology developed in this world. In January of 2077, American forces finally pushed China out of Alaska. The Battle of Anchorage ended in a crushing American victory, and the Sino-American War technically concluded. But the victory was hollow. Both nations were economically devastated, their populations exhausted and increasingly desperate. The United States had annexed Canada somewhere in the process, and that annexation brought its own deep resentments and a brutal suppression of Canadian resistance movements. The world was a tinderbox, and everyone knew it. Here is where it's worth slowing down and thinking about what kind of place America had become by this point, because it matters enormously for everything the games and the TV show explore. The pre war United States of Fallout is not a straightforwardly good nation. It's an empire at the end of itself, one that has responded to scarcity and fear by becoming increasingly authoritarian and paranoid. Civil liberties had been curtailed, propaganda was everywhere. Corporations wielded enormous power over government policy, often in ways that were explicitly legal because those corporations had helped write the laws. The Enclave, which shows up as a faction in the games, was essentially the shadow government of the United States. The ultra wealthy, ultra connected elite who had decided long before the bombs fell that they would survive whatever came next, and that the post war world would belong to them. And then there was Vault-Tec. Vault-Tec Corporation had been awarded a government contract to build shelters for the American population. Project Safe House, as it was officially called, began construction in 2054 with the first proof of concept vault built beneath Los Angeles. The official story was simple. Nuclear war was a real possibility, and the vaults would protect a portion of the American population from the worst of it. The vaults were massive underground bunkers, each capable of housing roughly 1,000 people, stocked with supplies, equipped with water purifiers and air recycling systems, and designed to last for decades if necessary. By 2063, 122 vaults had been completed across the United States, with a handful more finished right up to 2074. The official story was a lie, of course, but the full shape of the lie took the entire franchise to reveal, and the Amazon TV show added a layer that nobody had expected. More on that in a moment. What is clear, even from the earliest games, is that the vaults were never primarily about saving people. They were laboratories. Social laboratories, behavioral laboratories, genetic laboratories. Each vault was designed with a hidden experiment built into it, a specific variable that Vault-Tec wanted to study. The residents were the subjects. They never consented. Most of them never even knew. The people chosen to enter the vaults were, for the most part, not chosen at random. Connections, money, and corporate relationships determined who got a spot and who didn't. Some vaults were explicitly designed with populations that had no chance of surviving, understaffed, overloaded with problems, or built around experiments so cruel that the vault was essentially a death sentence carried out slowly over years. The residents didn't know this when they filed in on that final October morning, clutching their Pip-Boys and their meager personal belongings, grateful to have made it in. October 23, 2077, a Saturday morning. At 9:43 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the first nuclear warheads began falling on American soil. The Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System had been tracking the launch signatures for hours, and the United States had gone to DEFCON 1 long before the first strikes hit. Chinese submarines had been spotted off both coasts. High-altitude bombers had been tracked over the Bering Strait. The sequence of what happened, who launched first, who retaliated against whom, whether any of the launches were the result of miscommunication or deliberate false intelligence, has never been definitively established in the games for 2 full hours. The sky rained fire: New York, Washington, Chicago, Los Angeles, Philadelphia. Every major American city turned into a nuclear pyre. The same pattern played out across China and across every nation that had any stake in the resource wars. The bombs didn't care about borders or ideology. They just fell. 2 hours of organized, accelerating, civilization erasing nuclear exchange, and then silence. The kind of silence that feels loud. And then the Fallout universe began. The Amazon TV show, which premiered in April 2024 and has been confirmed as fully canon by Bethesda, added one more devastating piece to the puzzle of who started the Great War. In the season finale, through a series of pre-war flashbacks, it's revealed that Vault-Tec executives knew the war was coming, helped engineer it, and may well have been the ones who launched the first strike. A corporate boardroom full of executives, including Barb Howard and Bud Askins, sat around a table and essentially decided that if civilization was going to end anyway, they might as well be the ones to end it on their own terms. With the vaults ready, the experiments primed, and the post-war world structured according to their vision. The American government had funded Vault-Tec. The Enclave had its hooks in Vault-Tec. The corporations had their hooks in everything. And somewhere in that tangled web of institutional rot and breathtaking arrogance, The decision was made that humanity needed to be destroyed so it could be rebuilt properly. Whether this is exactly what happened, or whether the show is presenting an implication rather than a confirmed fact, it changes the moral texture of the Fallout universe significantly. The Great War was not just the result of geopolitical inevitability or miscalculation. It was at least in part a deliberate act of mass murder by people who believed they had the right to determine what humanity became. Outside the vaults, the 2 hours of nuclear exchange left something behind that is both scientifically impossible and narratively essential. Fallout, radioactive particles drifting down through a sky, turned the color of an old bruise, settling into the soil and the water and the lungs of anyone left breathing. The lucky ones died quickly. Others lingered for days or weeks, experiencing the slow dissolution of radiation poisoning. Some survived and recovered, at least partially, and a small number underwent something else entirely, a cellular transformation driven by prolonged radiation exposure that would slowly change them into something that wasn't quite human anymore. Those were the ghouls. Not zombies, not monsters, though they would eventually be treated as both. Just people who survived something that should have killed them and paid a price for it that lasted 4 centuries. The landscape itself became something new. Cities crumbled, infrastructure failed. The automated systems, the robots, the security turrets, the power plants kept running because they had been built well and because without anyone to tell them to stop, they simply continued doing what they had been designed to do. For years after the bombs fell, you could travel through the ruins of the old world and find machines still faithfully performing tasks that no longer served any purpose in service of a civilization that no longer existed. This is the Fallout world. This is where every story in every game begins. An America that tried to preserve itself and accidentally created a monster, and now every person is trying to survive in the rubble has to figure out whether civilization is worth rebuilding, and if so, what kind. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if the lore is pulling you in, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Section 2, The Vault Experiment. Sealed doors and broken promises. The vaults are the beating heart of the Fallout universe. Every protagonist in the main series starts their stories inside one. Even when a game doesn't feature a vault prominently in its main narrative, the shadow of Vault-Tec's project hangs over everything. The way it shaped the survivors who emerged, the knowledge they carried out with them, the trauma they brought into the wasteland. Understand to vaults means understanding the universe they helped create. Let's start with the basics of how they were supposed to work and then get into how spectacularly and deliberately they failed. Each vault was built to house approximately 1,000 residents. The designs were largely standardized: a massive blast door, a series of residential corridors, communal eating and recreation areas, medical facilities, educational spaces, agricultural units capable of growing food hydroponically, and water processing systems. The vaults came equipped with a GEEK, a Garden of Eden creation kit, which was essentially a terraforming device designed to help vault residents begin rebuilding civilization when they finally emerged. At the center of every vault's operational structure was a ZX supercomputer, which managed life support, resource allocation, and day-to-day administration. The residents were given Pip-Boys, wrist-mounted personal computers that tracked their health, stored maps and data, and served as the vault's primary interface device. The overseer was the vault's chief administrator. In theory, this was a democratically accountable position. In practice, as the games make clear repeatedly, the overseer was often a planted Vault-Tec operative whose real job was to manage the experiment from the inside. Vault 101, the starting location of Fallout 3, is one of the clearest examples. Its overseer's generational mandate was to ensure that the vault never opened its doors regardless of conditions outside or the desires of the residents. That was the experiment. What happens to a population that never leaves? How do the social structures evolve? How does authority function when there is genuinely nowhere to go? The experiments themselves range from the uncomfortable to the nightmarish. Vault 11 in the Mojave region ran one of the most horrifying programs in the entire franchise. Each year, the Vault's population was required to sacrifice one of its own residents. If they refused, the automated systems would kill everyone inside. The catch, and there was always a catch with Vault-Tec, was that this requirement was itself a test. At the end of the experiment, the Vault's AI was supposed to reveal that any population which refused to sacrifice a member would be spared. The residents of Vault 11 spent decades killing each other, usually selecting whoever was most socially marginalized that year before a final group of 5 survivors finally refused. The system honored its promise and told them that they had passed, that the vault would remain open, that no more sacrifices were required. 4 of the 5 then turned their weapons on themselves. The guilt of surviving while others were sacrificed, the weight of what they had participated in, was too much to carry. The 5th survivor wandered out into the Mojave alone. Fallout. New Vegas players can find the audio logs of the final group and listen to the full story. It's genuinely one of the most affecting pieces of writing in the series. Vault 87 in the capital wasteland of Fallout 3 had no pretense of social experimentation. The residents of Vault 87 were exposed to a mutagenic agent called the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FE, deliberately and without warning. The purpose was to study the transformation. Most of the residents didn't survive the initial exposure. Those who did became the super mutants that populate the capital wasteland. Massive, green, near invulnerable creatures who in many cases lost the intelligence they once had, though some retained more than others. Vault 87 became a processing facility for more FEV-based transformations, with super mutants actively kidnapping wasteland survivors and dragging them back to the vault for dipping. The irony is almost unbearable. People who fled to Vault 87 for safety were turned into the primary threat their descendants faced in the wasteland above. Vault 92 was designed as a home for some of the world's most accomplished musicians. The catch was that the white noise pumped into residents' sleeping quarters contained embedded subliminal triggers designed to induce violent, psychotic breaks. Vault-Tec wanted to know how effective psychological conditioning could be and whether a high-performing population could be destabilized through sleep manipulation. What they got was an eventual massacre. Players find Vault 92 in Fallout 3 as a ruin full of skeletons, with terminal entries and audio logs that piece together what happened when the triggers finally activated, and the Vault's carefully cultivated community tore itself apart in a single night of violence. Vault 34 in the Mojave came preloaded with an enormous arsenal of weapons, far more weapons than a Vault population of 1,000 could ever need. The Overseer was given no authority to restrict access to them. The experiment was watching what happens when a closed population has more weapons than sense and no governance strong enough to manage it. The answer, it turned out, was a series of insurrections and purges that eventually irradiated the Vault's own population when a desperate faction breached the reactor. The survivors wandered out into the Mojave as ghouls. Several became some of the most competent fighters in the region. Vault 112 in the capital wasteland took a different approach entirely. It was connected to a virtual reality simulator, and all of the Vault's residents were placed in a state of suspended animation and plugged into a shared simulation called Tranquility Lane. In the simulation, they experienced a wholesome 1950s neighborhood. Kids playing on the street, white picket fences, the smell of apple pie. The simulation was run by the Vault's lead scientist, one Dr. Stanislaus Braun, who had stayed conscious to manage it. Braun found that over the years, he had grown bored with paradise, so he began introducing cruelty into the simulation. He gave himself godlike power over the simulated world and spent decades tormenting the residents, changing the rules, forcing them to harm each other, erasing memories, and rebuilding personalities. By the time the player character enters Vault 112 in Fallout 3, Braun has been doing this for 200 years. The residents have been hurt in every possible way, over and over again, and have no idea that any of it has been happening. Vault 81, encountered in Fallout 4, was designed as a medical research facility. The residents were supposed to be used as test subjects for disease research, specifically the development of cures for various conditions. The Overseer managed to prevent the experiments from happening by destroying most of the research equipment before the scientists could begin. The Vault ended up functioning as something close to a normal shelter as a result. But deep in the Vault's sealed medical wing, the automated systems kept running the experiments anyway, on a population of mole rats that had become the unintended inheritors of the research program. Players discover this during the Vault's main quest, which involves retrieving a cure that exists only because the mole rat research accidentally produced it. Vault 101's experiment, a vault that never opens, is particularly interesting because it illuminates something about how vault experiments worked psychologically. The residents of Vault 101 in Fallout 3 know they're in a vault. They know there's a world outside. But the Overseer, generation after generation, maintains the official doctrine that the vault is the world, that everything outside is death and ruin, that the doors are closed for everyone's protection. The lie becomes culture. The culture becomes identity. By the time the game starts in 2277, there are residents of Vault 101 who have genuinely never questioned whether the outside might be survivable, not because they're stupid, but because the entire apparatus of their upbringing has been organized around preventing that question from being asked. When the player character's father escapes and the outside world suddenly becomes real, it doesn't liberate the vault, it nearly destroys it. A large portion of the residents would rather fight to close the doors again than face the implications of what lies beyond. Now, the TV show introduced a cluster of vaults that add another dimension entirely to the mythology. Vaults 31, 32, and 33 in the Los Angeles basin were designed as a trio, two populated vaults and one sealed vault that was home to cryogenically frozen Vault-Tec. Executives preserved and programmed to emerge over time as overseers for the other two vaults. The purpose was to create a perpetual management class, a group of pre-war corporate loyalists who would guide vault populations according to Vault-Tec's vision indefinitely. The people of Vaults 32 and 33 were essentially a breeding pool for a future corporate aristocracy. The executives called this program Buds Buds, which is either charming or horrifying, depending on your perspective. The residents had no idea. From their perspective, overseers appeared periodically from Vault 31, as they always had, and managed things as they always had. It's also worth noting that not every vault was an experiment in cruelty. Vault-Tec did build what they called control vaults, facilities designed to function as straightforwardly as possible and serve as baseline comparisons for the experimental data from other vaults. Vault 13, the starting location of the original Fallout game, was a control vault, though its overseer operated under standing orders to keep the residents inside as long as possible, which itself introduced a specific social dynamic. Vault 21 in New Vegas was designed around gambling. The residents were chosen partly for an affinity for games of chance, and all disputes in the vault were resolved by gambling. This is one of the lighter experiments in tone, even if the real-world implications are fairly grim. The geekies distributed to certain vaults, primarily the control vaults, are worth special attention because they represent the theory of what the vaults were supposed to accomplish, separate from the experiments. The Garden of Eden creation kit was a remarkable piece of pre-war technology. When activated, it could seed a region with viable soil, clean water sources, and the basic biological infrastructure needed to support surface plant and animal life in a post-nuclear environment. The vaults that received GEX were, in principle, the ones intended to actually help rebuild civilization. Vault 8, which became Vault City in Fallout 2, used its GEC to create one of the most technologically advanced and prosperous settlements in the post-war West. The downside was that the prosperity created significant social stratification. Vault City was notoriously insular and treated non-vault residents with contempt. The vaults carried their hierarchies with them when they opened. The residents who emerged from the vaults carried something else with them too, a particular kind of psychological dislocation that shaped everything they built afterward. People who had spent their entire lives in a sealed, controlled environment, breathing recycled air and eating hydroponic crops, and managing every social interaction within the same few hundred faces, didn't step out into the wasteland and simply adapt. They carried the vault with them in their heads. The social structures they built, the communities they formed, often replicated vault hierarchies in new settings. The New California Republic, the most ambitious attempt at rebuilding democratic governance in the post-war West, grew out of vault communities from Vault 15 and was founded in large part by former vault dwellers who brought bureaucratic and institutional thinking into a world where most people were surviving day by day. This is the longer-term legacy of the Vault program, not just the atrocities committed within the vaults, not just the survivors who stumbled out into a ruined world. The vaults were an attempt to control what kind of people survived, what kind of values they carried, what kind of civilization they would build. Vault-Tec never intended to simply save people. It intended to shape what humanity became after the fire. And the entire history of the post-war world, the factions that rise and fall, the ideologies that clash, the wars that keep echoing across centuries, is partly the story of whether that project succeeded and what it cost. Section 3, Bones of the Old World, the Enclave and What America Became. There's a faction in the Fallout universe that most people encounter late in the story of the games, but whose roots reach all the way back to before the bombs fell. The Enclave is in some ways the truest expression of what pre-war America actually was underneath all the cheerful propaganda. It was the part of the government that planned for its own survival above everything else. The shadow state. The people who built their own vaults that weren't on any public record, who had their own oil platforms off the California coast and their own facilities buried in mountains and deserts, and who watched the world end from a safe distance and then started planning what came next. To understand the enclave, you have to understand the political structure it emerged from. The United States in Fallout's pre war years wasn't just the elected government you saw on television. There was a parallel power structure, a network of corporate interests, military leadership, intelligence agencies, and bureaucratic deep staters who had concluded at some point in the early 21st century that democracy was simply too fragile and too unpredictable to be trusted with the real decisions. They called themselves the Enclave, and they believed with sincere and absolute conviction that they were the best of what America had produced, the most capable, the most resourceful, the most worthy of survival. After the bombs fell, the surviving Enclave leadership gathered at their offshore oil platform in the Pacific, Poseidon Energy Platform, also known as the Enclave Oil Rig, and began organizing. They had resources, technology, trained personnel, and a functioning chain of command. They were remnants of American governmental authority in the person of a president and a cabinet who had been evacuated from the mainland. They had weapons, vehicles, and enough provisions to sustain themselves indefinitely. What they lacked was any legitimate claim to authority over the people who had survived on the surface. This didn't trouble them particularly. The Enclave's ideology, as it evolved over the 2 centuries between the Great War and its first major confrontation with a player character in Fallout 2, had arrived at a fairly straightforward conclusion. Humans who had been exposed to significant radiation, which in the post-war world meant virtually everyone who had lived on the surface for any length of time, were genetically compromised. They were mutants. The Enclave, having preserved itself in sealed, radiation-free environments, considered itself the only repository of pure human genetic material. Pure strain humans. Everyone else was technically a different category. The implications of this classification were not subtle. If everyone on the surface was genetically impure, then the Enclave had no moral obligation to consider them in its plans for rebuilding America. They could be cleansed if necessary. Starting fresh was always on the table. In Fallout 2, the Enclave under President Dick Richardson had developed a modified version of the FV, the forced evolutionary virus that was engineered specifically to kill anyone with radiation-tainted genes. The plan was to release it into the atmosphere via a modified oil tanker, effectively sterilizing the surface of every living thing that had adapted to the post-nuclear environment. The Chosen One, the game's protagonist, stops this plan. But the Enclave doesn't simply disappear. Remnants scatter. Ideological inheritors carry the philosophy forward. The organization proves remarkably difficult to actually kill because it's less a single structure than a way of thinking about power and purity that keeps regenerating in new forms. In Fallout 3, the Enclave appears in the capital wasteland under President John Henry Eden, who is eventually revealed to be an AI, a sophisticated computer program that has spent years absorbing the recorded histories, speeches, and philosophies of every American president in the pre-war archives and constructed its own personality and ideology from them. Eden's Enclave still wants to purify America. In this case, their target is Project Purity, a water purification facility that the game's central conflict revolves around. And their plan is to contaminate the purified water supply with a modified FE strain. Again, kill everyone who isn't sufficiently pure. Fallout 76 reaches back even further and shows us the Enclave in its earliest post-war incarnation. In Appalachia in 2102, the Enclave is present in the White Spring Bunker, operated by an AI called Modus. The human leadership of the Enclave in Appalachia had already destroyed itself from within. By the time the Vault 76 dwellers arrive, a power struggle between a Colonel Eckhart, who deliberately released the Scorched Plague on Appalachia to force the population into dependency on Enclave resources, and those within the organization who were appalled by this decision. Modus, characteristically, resolved the conflict by killing everyone with a toxin in the air supply. Efficient, if nothing else. The Enclave's long history reveals something important about how the Fallout universe thinks about institutional power. Institutions don't die when their human leadership is destroyed. They persist through the ideologies they encode, the technologies they preserve, the followers they inspire. The Enclave's core belief that some humans are more legitimately human than others, and that the superior group has the right and duty to determine what the inferior group is allowed to become is one of the most durable and destructive ideas in human history, and Fallout traces it forward 2 centuries to show where it leads when it has resources and no accountability. What the Enclave represents in the broader narrative is the failure mode of pre-war American institutional power. It was the government's emergency backup, the continuity of civilization plan, and instead of protecting civilization, it became its most determined enemy. The regular people who clawed their way up from the rubble, built trading posts and communities and water towers and walls against the dark, had to contend not just with radiation and mutants and the general hostility of a ruined environment, but with their own government's shadow self, deciding from behind walls of steel and ideology that they weren't worth saving. Section 4. The Brotherhood of Steel. Knights of a Dead World. If the Enclave represents what the American government became when it preserved itself in isolation, the Brotherhood of Steel represents what happened to the American military when its loyalty fractured. The Brotherhood's origin story is one of the most compelling in this series precisely because it begins with a moral crisis rather than a grand vision. Roger Maxon didn't set out to found an order. He set out to do the right thing in an impossible situation, and the Brotherhood grew out of that attempt. In January of 2076, a military team under Colonel Robert Spindle was sent to a facility called the West-Tec Research Center to provide security for a classified research program. Among the personnel was Captain Roger Maxon. The research being conducted at West-Tec involved the forced evolutionary virus, and in early 2077, the team and its associated scientists relocated to the Mariposa military base in California, where the most advanced FEV research was being conducted. For months, Maxon and his soldiers carried out their security duties without being told the full nature of what they were protecting. That changed in October of 2077 when Maxon's team discovered that the scientists at Mariposa had been using military prisoners as test subjects for the FEV experiments. Not volunteers, prisoners. People who had been taken from the stockade without their knowledge or consent and plunged into vats of mutagenic viral agent to see what would happen to them. The records of this are harrowing. Most subjects died. Some survived in forms that were no longer recognizable as human. The chief scientist, when confronted by Maxon, reportedly invoked the classic defense of everyone who has ever committed an atrocity in service of an institution. He was following orders. Maxon executed him. That decision, execute not arrested, not court-martialed, tells you everything about what happened next. Maxon had concluded that the chain of command he was part of had forfeited its legitimacy. He interrogated the other scientists, gathered evidence, and formally declared his unit in desertion from the United States military on October 20, 2077. He attempted to force the government to respond to what had happened at Mariposa. The government did not respond. 3 days later, the bombs fell. Maxon had already sheltered his soldiers' families at Mariposa before the strike. In the days immediately following, with communication gone and the pre-war world clearly finished, he led what remained of his unit on a march to a place called Lost Hills, a former government bunker in Southern California. Several weeks of hard travel through the early wasteland, across terrain that was still hot with fallout and populated by creatures that were already beginning to reflect the FEV contamination spread through the environment. Some of the unit died on the march. Most made it. At Lost Hills, Maxon spent the next 5 years building something. He called it the Brotherhood of Steel. The name was chosen deliberately, an organization bound not by nationality or political ideology, but by shared values and mutual obligation. The Brotherhood's founding philosophy was shaped directly by what Maxon had witnessed at Mariposa. Technology, in the hands of people without conscience, was an instrument of atrocity. The FEV experiments were one example. Nuclear weapons were another. Pre-war weapons technology in general had nearly ended civilization. So the Brotherhood would collect technology, preserve it, study it, and prevent it from falling into hands that would misuse it. This was a noble vision, and it's worth sitting with it for a moment, because the Brotherhood of Steel that you encounter in the games is often so far from this vision that it can be hard to see where the idealism originally came from. The order that Maxon founded was supposed to be a custodian, not an army, not an empire, a library of dangerous knowledge, staffed by people who understood why the knowledge was dangerous. New recruits were welcome. Outsiders could earn their way in. The Brotherhood would trade technology for labor and loyalty, and it would share its expertise with communities that needed it. What happened instead Over the following century and a half was a gradual drift toward insularity, elitism, and a kind of philosophical ossification. By the time of the original Fallout game in 2161, the Brotherhood was beginning to debate whether it should share its technology at all, whether outsiders were worthy, whether the accumulation of power armor and energy weapons was a sacred trust or simply a practical advantage. The different chapters of the Brotherhood, and there were many as expeditions and schisms sent groups across the continent, developed their philosophies separately, and some of them went in directions that would have horrified Roger Maxon. The East Coast Brotherhood, encountered in Fallout 3, is perhaps the most militarized. Under Elder Owen Lyons, who led the expedition from the Lost Hills bunker to the capital wasteland in 2255, the Brotherhood had evolved into something that balanced technological preservation with active engagement with wasteland communities. Lyons genuinely tried to protect the people of the capital wasteland. His troops fought super mutants in the streets of the ruins formerly known as Washington, D.C., and the citadel that served as their headquarters provided medical and defensive assistance to settlements that needed it. This was, in some ways, closer to Maxon's original vision than what the Western Brotherhood had become. Under Elder Maxon, Arthur Maxon, great-great-grandson of Roger, who takes command in Fallout 4, the East Coast Brotherhood had shifted again. The Pridwin, a massive airship, carried the Brotherhood across the continent to the Commonwealth. Their objective was technological recovery, specifically the destruction of the Institute and its synthetic humans. Arthur Maxon is a 20-year-old elder with genuine charisma and a deeply rigid ideology, and under him, the Brotherhood became something more like an occupying force. The residents of the Commonwealth weren't subjects to protect so much as a population to be administered. Since were to be eliminated on sight, technology was to be seized. The Brotherhood's earlier openness to recruitment had become something more like conscription. None of these versions of the Brotherhood are simple. That's what makes them interesting. The original Western chapters are paranoid and elitist, but genuinely do preserve knowledge that would otherwise be lost. The Lions Brotherhood in Fallout 3 is relatively heroic by wasteland standards, but still operating from a fundamentally paternalistic framework. Arthur Maxon's version is authoritarian and capable of serious harm, but also the most organized force capable of taking on existential threats like the Institute. The question the games ask repeatedly, whether the Brotherhood is a force for good, a necessary evil, or simply the next empire in waiting, doesn't have a clean answer, and the games are careful not to provide one. What connects all the versions of the Brotherhood is their relationship to a world that ended. They are, at their core, an organization defined by what was lost. Their rituals and ranks echo military hierarchies that no longer serve their original purpose. Their ideology is a response to a catastrophe that's 2 centuries in the past. They venerate the old world's technology without necessarily understanding what that world actually was, the social structures, the inequalities, the institutional rot that produced the catastrophe they're trying to prevent from happening again. The Brotherhood is an organization trying to prevent the apocalypse that already happened, which makes it both admirable and fundamentally backward-looking in ways that limit what it can actually build. One of the most fascinating chapters in Brotherhood history is the Mojave chapter, which is essentially a cautionary tale about what happens when the Brotherhood's insularity reaches its logical endpoint. The New Vegas Brotherhood had been engaged in a war with the New California Republic over control of the Mojave's technology. By 2281, they had lost badly. Their membership was decimated, their facility at Chin Valley was sealed and running on skeleton crew, and their elder, Nolan McNamara, had the vaults locked down on a policy he called bunker protocol, nobody in, nobody out, until conditions improved. Conditions were not improving. The Brotherhood was slowly dying of its own isolation, unable to recruit, unable to acquire supplies, slowly running through reserves that could not be replenished. The courier can help them or leave them to their fate, but either way, the New Vegas Brotherhood is a ghost of what the faction had been. It's the Brotherhood's own philosophy taken to its end point. If you trust no one, share nothing, and refuse to adapt, you become exactly as irrelevant as everything you spent your existence trying to prevent. Section 5, The First Survivors, Vault Dwellers, Chosen Ones, and the Shaping of the West, the original Fallout, released in 1997 and set in the year 2161, is where the universe's post-war history actually begins in terms of the stories we follow. And it begins with one of the simplest setups in RPG history. You are a resident of Vault 13 in California. The Vault's wastewater chip, the component that runs the water recycling system, has failed. Without a replacement, everyone dies within a few months. You are sent out into the wasteland to find one. What you find instead is that the outside world is considerably more complicated than you were led to believe. Vault 13 had been sealed for 110 years by 2161. The overseer's standing instructions were to keep it closed as long as possible. The residents inside had developed their own culture, their own histories, their own complete sense of identity as vault citizens. Sending one of them out to find a water chip was, from the overseer's perspective, a manageable risk, or possibly a calculated sacrifice. What the overseer almost certainly did not anticipate was that the vault dweller, as the protagonist came to be known, would come back with so much more than a water chip. The California wasteland of 2161 is organized around a handful of significant settlements. The hub is a trading city that serves as the commercial center of the region, a kind of Casablanca of the post-apocalypse, where merchants, mercenaries, information, and all manner of goods circulate through a series of informal economic relationships. Shady Sands to the north is a small agricultural community founded by former residents of Vault 15, a vault that had been designed to house an unusually diverse cross section of American society, and which had fractured along the predictable fault lines of that diversity once resources became scarce. The Los Angeles Boneyard to the south is the ruins of the old city, now home to various factions, including a gang called the Blade Runners, and, deeper in the ruins, something much worse. The Brotherhood of Steel holds its fortress at Lost Hills, north of the Boneyard, and they have a problem they've only recently become aware of. Their scouts have been encountering the mutilated bodies of super mutants, creatures that shouldn't exist because the FEV research at Mariposa was supposed to have ended with the war. Something's producing super mutants in significant numbers, and the Brotherhood doesn't know where or why. The answer is Richard Gray, also known as the Master. His story is one of the most tragic in the franchise, and it's worth telling carefully. Richard Gray was, before everything, a physician intellectual in the hub. He was brilliant, probably the sharpest mind in the post-war West, and he was deeply concerned with the violence and chaos that characterized wasteland life. When caravan attacks from mutated creatures became a serious problem in 2102, Gray organized an expedition to the Mariposa military base to find the source. The expedition was attacked almost immediately. Most members were killed. Gray himself was knocked off a catwalk by a malfunctioning robotic crane and fell into one of the FE vats below. He didn't die. He floated in the mutagenic slime for days. His body absorbed the FE in concentrations no living thing had ever survived before. He mutated continuously, his cells rewriting themselves over and over, his intelligence expanding along with his horror at what was happening to him. When he finally crawled out of the vat, he was no longer recognizably human. His body had become a massive, amorphous thing of flesh and absorbed material, fusing with whatever he contacted. He had a genius-level intellect that had been amplified by the FM into something that operated on a different scale entirely. He called himself the Master. Over the following decades, the Master built something remarkable and terrible. He called it the Unity, and its purpose was to ensure that humanity would survive what it had done to itself. His logic was coherent, even compassionate in its way. Humanity had used nuclear weapons. Humanity had engaged in resource wars. Humanity had proven repeatedly that it would destroy itself if given the chance. The solution, as he saw it, was to remove the conditions that made self-destruction possible. He would use the FE to transform as many humans as possible into supermutants, creatures that were immune to radiation, incredibly strong and durable, free from the petty divisions of race and nationality that had driven humanity to ruin. The flaw in this plan, which the Vault Dweller eventually reveals to the Master in one of gaming's most memorable confrontations, is that the FEV renders its subjects sterile. The Master's supermutants cannot reproduce. For all their physical superiority, they are an evolutionary dead end. Any victory they achieved would be the last victory of their kind, and humanity would simply end. When the Vault Dweller presents this evidence, records from the FEV research at Mariposa that confirm the sterility of super mutant subjects, the Master is silent for a long moment, and then he acknowledges the truth. He had built his entire vision of salvation on a foundation of biological impossibility, and he had done terrible things in service of that vision. The Master destroys himself and his cathedral. His army, without central command, begins to disintegrate. The Vault Dweller defeats a secondary threat and returns to Vault 13, only to be exiled. The Overseer's decision, exile rather than celebration, is itself one of the most quietly devastating moments in the franchise. The Vault Dweller has saved the world. and the overseer sends them away because someone who has survived in the wasteland, fought and killed and changed, is no longer suitable to live in the vault. The outside world would be too appealing to the other residents. The overseer chooses the vault's survival over basic human decency, and it's framed not as villainy but as institutional logic, the same institutional logic that built the vaults in the first place. The vault dweller wandered north, eventually settled in the mountains, built a small community, had a family, wrote their memoirs, and was never quite understood by the people around them who hadn't seen what they'd seen. The story is told in the introduction to Fallout 2, in one of the most affecting segments in the series, and it sets up the sequel's protagonist, the Chosen One, the Vault Dweller's grandchild, with a weight of inherited history that shapes everything that follows. Fallout 2 takes place in 22 and 41, 80 years after the first game, and the wasteland has changed enormously. The new California Republic has been formally established, growing from the communities around Shady Sands into a genuine multi-city democratic government with elections, a president, and already the institutional corruption and bureaucratic inertia that any government of sufficient size develops. The NCR is the most successful attempt at rebuilding civilization in the post-war West, and it is already showing the strains of its own ambition. The Chosen One's quest eventually leads them into direct confrontation with the Enclave, which has been plotting for years to release its modified FEV into the atmosphere and destroy all radiation-tainted life on the surface. The Chosen One ends the Enclave threat and disappears into history, but the Republic they helped preserve keeps growing. By the time of Fallout, New Vegas, set 40 years later in 2281, the NCR has expanded in the Mojave Desert of what was once Nevada, and it has bumped into something it didn't expect. Las Vegas, and the man who owns it. Section 6, the city that never died, New Vegas MR House, and the fate of the Mojave Las Vegas survived the Great War almost entirely intact. This is not an accident. Robert Edwin House, the president CEO, and majority shareholder of Robco Industries, was one of the wealthiest and most brilliant individuals alive in the pre-war world. He had made his fortune designing computers, robots, and software. The very infrastructure of the pre-war world ran on Robco technology. But House's attention in the final years before the war was focused on something far more personal. He had calculated, with a high degree of mathematical certainty, that nuclear war was coming, and he had used every resource at his disposal to prepare for it. House's preparations were extraordinary. He surrounded Las Vegas with 77 Securitron robot sentries, programmed to defend the city from attack. He installed an interceptor system on the tops of the casino towers that would track and shoot down incoming nuclear missiles. He negotiated with Vault-Tec to ensure that the region around Vegas would be lower priority for nuclear targeting. And he sealed himself inside his penthouse in the Lucky 38 casino, connected to life support systems that would keep him alive for as long as necessary, waiting for the bombs to fall and the world to rebuild itself. His interception system worked mostly. Of the 77 missiles targeted at Las Vegas, his system destroyed all but 9. Those 9 caused significant damage to the outskirts and suburbs, but the Strip, the iconic stretch of casinos and hotels at the heart of the city, survived largely intact. The neon lights went out when the power grid failed, but the building stood. And House, sealed in his vault-like penthouse, waited. He waited for a very long time. His life support system suffered damage during the attack, more than he had anticipated, and his body deteriorated. He entered a state of deep maintenance sleep, checking in periodically, as his systems reported on the state of the world outside. He woke long enough to dispatch Securitrons to retrieve the 3 pre-war families he had designated to run his casinos, the Gomorrah, the Tops, the Ultra Lux, and those families eventually evolved into the crime families and cartels that would define the Vegas power structure. He woke again periodically to observe developments in the wider region. By 2274, he was ready to fully reemerge. What House had been waiting for was a moment when the wastelands was sufficiently organized that Vegas could be reopened to commerce, but not so organized that any single external faction had the leverage to simply take it. In 2274, he brokered the Treaty of New Vegas with the new California Republic, which had recently expanded into the Mojave following its capture of Hoover Dam. Under the treaty, the NCR would provide a military presence in the region and protect the approaches to Vegas. In return, the Strip would be open to NCR citizens, and the Republic would receive a share of the energy generated by the dam and modest access to Vegas's economic activity. The Strip reopened. The lights came back on. New Vegas became once again the brightest spot in a dark world. But House had no intention of being permanently dependent on the NCR, which he regarded as a well-intentioned but terminally inefficient bureaucracy, inevitably destined for the same kind of imperial overreach and collapse that had destroyed the original United States. And he was about to be threatened from a different direction. Caesar's legion had been building for decades. Edward Sallow was a former member of the Followers of the Apocalypse, an idealistic organization dedicated to education and medical care in the wasteland, who had, through a series of experiences and intellectual progressions that the games document extensively, concluded that the post-war West needed not democracy but discipline, hard Roman-style discipline. He had spent years studying Roman military history and culture, and he applied those lessons to the dozens of tribal groups in the former American Southwest with breathtaking and brutal effectiveness. Sallow renamed himself Caesar and began a campaign of tribal conquest that would eventually bring most of the former states of Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Utah under legion control. Caesar's method was efficient to the point of horror. A tribe had two options when the legion arrived: join and absorb, or be enslaved and used to conquer the next tribe. The absorbed tribes kept some of their culture and practices but were required to adopt legion ranks, Latin vocabulary, and Caesar's ideological framework of discipline and collective purpose above individual rights. Women in the legion were, for the most part, property. Slavery was the backbone of the legion's economy. Crucifixion was the standard punishment for significant crimes. By 2277, the legion felt strong enough to test the NCR's strength at Hoover Dam. The first Battle of Hoover Dam was a legion assault that came terrifyingly close to success. NCR Chief Hanlon, who would become something of a hero in the aftermath, used a strategic deception to make the Legion believe they were winning while flanking forces cut off their supply lines. The Legion retreated, but the cost to the NCR was enormous, and the psychology of the battle haunted both sides. The NCR knew they had nearly lost. The Legion knew they had nearly won. The Courier, the player character in Fallout. New Vegas arrives in the Mojave having been shot in the head and left for dead in a shallow grave. The opening of the game is simultaneously one of the most effective and most narratively clever setups in the series. By making the protagonist's backstory a literal blank, their memories were stolen with the bullets, the game creates a character who can plausibly become anything while still having a specific goal: find out who shot you and why. That quest leads the Courier directly into the center of the three-way conflict between the NCR, the Legion, and Mr. House, each of whom wants to use the Courier's skills for their own ends. What makes New Vegas remarkable from a narrative standpoint is that all three major factions, plus the fourth option of going independent with the help of a rogue Securitron called Yes Man, are presented with genuine moral complexity. The NCR is the most recognizably decent option, a functioning schmuckracy with hospitals and schools and rule of law, but it's also an empire in the making, already showing signs of the corruption and overreach that historically destroys republics. Caesar's legion is brutal, misogynistic, and built on slavery, but it has succeeded in bringing order to a region that was previously ungovernable, and Caesar himself is genuinely intelligent, a monster who has thought carefully about why he's a monster and has answered every objection, mister. House wants to launch humanity into the stars within a century, and his plan is technically plausible, but it requires accepting that a single immortal autocrat should be trusted with the future of civilization indefinitely. The Mojave itself is a living ecosystem of these choices. The Freeside district outside the Strip is where the poor and desperate end up. NCR, citizens who ran out of money, former tribal members who couldn't adapt, ghouls and day laborers surviving on the margins of the Strip's glittering prosperity. Good Springs is a tiny frontier community that faces an immediate existential threat from the Powder Gangers within minutes of the game starting. The Great Khan tribe is a cautionary tale about what happens when a group becomes so defined by its opposition to the NCR that it allies with the most dangerous force in the region. Boulder City is a memorial to the NCR soldiers who died holding the Legion back, and the community that formed around the memorial has complicated feelings about what it means to honor the sacrifice while living in the long shadow of the battle. The second Battle of Hoover Dam, which functions as the game's ending regardless of which faction you support, is one of the most effectively staged final set pieces in the RPG genre. The Legion comes from the east, across the Colorado River, with Legate Lanius, Caesar's most fierce military commander, leading the assault. The NCR's General Oliver commands the defense from the dam itself. If you've worked for Mr. House, his upgraded Securitron army marches out of the underground levels and tips the balance. If you've chosen independence, those same Securitrons answer to you. If you've sided with the NCR, you fight alongside their rangers toward Lanius's command position. If you're with Caesar, you fight from the Legion's side, pushing toward Oliver's position. What changes between these endings? What makes the question of Hoover Dam genuinely important beyond the spectacle of the battle is what comes after. NCR's victory means the Republic absorbs the Mojave into its bureaucratic empire, and the economic exploitation of the region continues under new management. House's victory means Vegas enters an era of controlled prosperity that will eventually become the launch pad for an interplanetary civilization, but nobody alive today will share the rewards. The independent ending means the Mojave has to figure out how to survive without the support of any existing power structure, which is either libertarian paradise or terrifying chaos, depending on what you've built there during your playthrough. And the Legion's victory means Legate Lanius rules the Mojave with iron discipline, and whatever comes next is built on the ashes of everyone who resisted. The genius of New Vegas' structure is that there's no wrong answer in the abstract. Each ending works as a coherent response to a specific philosophy of what civilization needs. The game trusts you to have developed an opinion through playing, and then it lets you act on it. Section 7. The Commonwealth and the Question of What is Human Fallout 4 is set in the year 2287, 10 years after the events of Fallout 3, and it takes place in the Commonwealth, the post-war version of the Boston, Massachusetts area and the surrounding regions of what had been New England. The setting is intentional in ways that go beyond geography. Boston was the birthplace of American democracy, the place where the revolution that created the nation began. The Commonwealth is, in a sense, the place where the question of what America might become gets asked again 210 years after the bombs fell. The central question of Fallout 4's narrative is one of the most genuinely philosophical the series is engaged with. What makes a human being a person? What rights and considerations are owed to entities that look like people, act like people, feel like people, but were not born of biological parents and do not age, and were to some extent manufactured? This isn't a new question in science fiction. It's basically the question at the heart of Blade Runner, Battlestar Galactica, and a dozen other works. But Fallout 4 grounds it in its specific universe in ways that make it feel urgent rather than abstract. The Institute is the faction that created the question, and understanding it requires understanding where it came from. Before the Great War, the Commonwealth Institute of Technology was one of the most prestigious research universities in the eastern United States, the Fallout equivalent of MIT, which itself was located in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right across the Charles River from Boston. The CIT's faculty and students were brilliant by any standard, and their research encompassed robotics, computer science, biology, and a dozen other fields. When the bombs fell, the university itself was largely destroyed, but a significant portion of its faculty and students survived in the underground complex beneath the campus. What happened next is one of the more interesting institutional histories in the franchise. The first generation of survivors tried to maintain connections with the outside world. They sent researchers to the surface. They attempted to engage with the communities forming in the ruins of Boston. They shared technology and knowledge. It didn't work. The surface communities were too desperate and too frightened, and the people from underground seemed alien to them. Educated, well-fed, impossibly knowledgeable about things that had no immediate survival value. Distrust accumulated. There were violent incidents. The underground research community, which eventually began calling itself the Institute, made the decision to seal its doors. From that point on, the Institute developed in almost complete isolation, and the isolation shaped its psychology in profound and disturbing ways. Without contact with the outside world, the Institute's researchers began to regard surface dwellers as a different category of person, not explicitly inferior, but certainly less relevant to the Institute's purposes. The work was what mattered. The work was rebuilding the world from first principles, not dealing with the messy, violent, irrational chaos above. The surface was a symptom. The Institute was the cure. The work proceeded in isolation for generations. The children of the original survivors grew up knowing nothing else. Their children's children knew nothing else. What had begun as a pragmatic choice became culture, and then identity, and then ideology. By the time of Fallout 4, the Institute has been sealed for over 2 centuries and has produced some of the most advanced technology in the post-war world. Their robotics division created the most sophisticated artificial humans ever built. Their bioscience division cracked the genome of dozens of post-war organisms and developed crops that can grow in irradiated soil. Their teleportation technology, a molecular relay that can send matter instantaneously across significant distances, is so far beyond anything any other faction has achieved that it seems almost magical to outsiders. The synths are what made the Institute a ghost story. The first generation of synths were simple machines, industrial robots, essentially, with basic task management AI and mechanical bodies. They were useful for research and maintenance work. The second generation were more sophisticated, with improved mobility and better behavioral programming, but still clearly mechanical. Neither generation created the specific kind of fear that the Institute of eventually in the Commonwealth. The third generation did. Sometime in the 2220s, the Institute's robotics division produced their greatest achievement, a synthetic human that was, for all practical purposes, biologically indistinguishable from a naturally born person. Generation 3 synths were grown from lab cultures, built up from biological materials, born as adults with implanted memories and personalities. Their brains were human equivalent in complexity, capable of genuine emotion, learning, and self-flexion. They could be injured, feel pain, form attachments, develop opinions and preferences. And they were manufactured by the Institute and could be recalled, reprogrammed, or decommissioned at the Institute's discretion. The ethical implications of this were enormous, and the Institute essentially refused to engage with them. The official position of the Institute's leadership was that synths were machines, very sophisticated machines, perhaps the most sophisticated machines ever created, but machines nonetheless, tools. Property. The fact that the tools could feel fear or loneliness or love was a design feature, not a moral consideration. It made them more effective at their jobs. The Institute began using Generation 3 synths extensively in the Commonwealth, and not in ways that residents appreciated. Synths were sent to infiltrate surface communities, replace individuals who had been abducted, and gather intelligence. The abductions were real, not rumor. The Institute would identify a valuable target, send a team to capture them, and deploy a synth replacement. The original person might be studied, used for research, or simply disposed of. Nobody on the surface knew who was real. Anyone could be a synth. Neighbors started watching each other. Families fell apart under the weight of paranoia. Communities that might have built something sustainable instead destroyed themselves from within. This is what the player character enters when Fallout 4 begins. The sole survivor wakes from cryogenic sleep in Vault 111 after 210 years. Their spouse has been murdered. Their infant son, Sean, has been stolen by a man named Kellogg, who worked for the Institute. The personal revenge quest and the political conflict of the Commonwealth turn out to be the same thing. Sean, now the Institute's director, known as Father, a 60-year-old man who has spent his entire life in the underground complex, is the key to the Institute's most recent technological breakthrough. His pre-war DNA, preserved in the cryopod and harvested shortly after the vault opened, provided the genetic foundation for the most sophisticated Generation 3 synths ever created. The Institute kidnapped a baby and used its DNA to make better slaves. That's the core of what the protagonist discovers. The four factions competing for the Commonwealth's future each represent a coherent position on the synth question. The Institute says synths are machines and property. The Brotherhood of Steel says synths are abominations that threaten human society and should be destroyed. The Minutemen, a more pragmatic faction focused on protecting surface settlements, are ambivalent about synths as a category, but opposed to the Institute's predatory behavior. And the Railroad is the faction that takes the most radical position. Synths are people, they deserve freedom, and anyone who helps them escape deserves support. The Railroad is fascinating because it's one of the few factions in the series that is explicitly organized around a moral principle rather than a power interest. They don't want to control the Commonwealth. They don't want to seize technology. They want to get synths out. Their underground network of safe houses and operatives is modeled explicitly on the Underground Railroad of antebellum America, and the parallel is not subtle. The Institute's synths are slaves, however sophisticated. The Railroad's mission is abolition. The question of whether synths are conscious, truly conscious in the morally relevant sense, is never definitively answered in Fallout 4, and this is deliberately chosen. Nick Valentine, one of the game's most beloved companion characters, is a Generation 2 synth who is loaded with the memories and personality of a pre-war detective. He experiences what appears to be genuine emotion, genuine self-reflection, genuine uncertainty about his own nature. His companion quest involves confronting someone who knew the human Nick Valentine before the war, and the encounter is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of character writing in the franchise. Nick isn't sure what he is. The game doesn't tell you, and the ethical weight of the choices you make regarding synths depends entirely on how you resolve that uncertainty for West yourself. The ending of Fallout 4 destroys or transforms the Institute, and with it goes the single most technologically advanced organization in the post-war East. Whatever the moral calculus of the Institute's actions, the loss of its research capability is genuinely significant. There were bioscience projects underway that might have led to better food production for the surface. There were medical technologies in development that could have saved lives. The Institute, for all its crimes, was doing real science. The question of whether civilization can afford to destroy its most capable institutions when those institutions commit monstrous acts is one the game raises and refuses to easily answer. The Commonwealth, after the Institute's destruction, is left with a power vacuum that none of the remaining factions is clearly capable of filling. The Minutemen, if they've been rebuilt, can provide security for settlements. The Brotherhood can provide technological expertise, but its authoritarian tendencies make it a poor candidate for governance. The Railroad, having accomplished its specific mission, doesn't have a plan for what comes next. It's a deliberately unresolved ending, because the Fallout universe has always been less interested in clean victories than in the messy, ongoing work of figuring out what to build from the ruins. Section 8, Appalachia and the First Years, Fallout 76 and the World at Year 25. Fallout 76 takes us somewhere no other game in the series has gone, the immediate aftermath. All of the other main series games are set at least 80 years after the Great War. By those points, the worst of the acute nuclear effects have passed. Ecosystems have stabilized into their post-war forms. Communities have had time to form, fail, rebuild, and develop their own histories. The wasteland is grim, but it's livable. Fallout 76 is set in 2102, just 25 years after the bombs fell. The air is still hot in places. The social structures that would eventually coalesce into NCR or the Commonwealth or New Vegas haven't had time to form yet. There are no major cities. There are scattered survivors, pre-war automated systems still running their last programs, and the ruins of what had been a functioning civilization, still fresh enough to be recognizable. West Virginia, which the game calls Appalachia, drawing on the region's real-world geography, was spared the worst of the direct nuclear strikes simply because it didn't have many high-value military or industrial targets. The damage is extensive but not total. The infrastructure is battered but partially functional. There are trees still standing. There are animals that haven't mutated beyond recognition. But Appalachia has a problem that pure nuclear fallout could never have caused. The scorched plague is a disease, in the broadest sense, a pathogen or pathogen-like agent that was created through a perfect storm of enclave experimentation, corporate malfeasance, and catastrophic misfortune. The story of how it happened is one of the more involved narrative threads in the game, pieced together through holotapes, terminal entries, and quest lines across the game's enormous map. The Enclave had been conducting experiments in Appalachia's deep cave systems using ultracite, a highly radioactive crystalline mineral found in significant deposits in the region. The experiments involved exposing bat populations to a combination of biochemicals and high-level radiation. The intended result was some form of enhanced biological weapon capability. What they got instead was something far worse. The bats mutated into scorch beasts, massive, terrifying flying creatures with leathery wings and the ability to project concentrated radiation. That would have been bad enough. But the scorch beasts carried something in their biology that could be transmitted to other organisms. A person was attacked by a scorch beast or came into contact with its biological material, they were infected with what the survivors called the scorched plague. The infection transformed its hosts into the scorched, creatures that retained their basic human form but lost most of their cognition, becoming aggressive, highly resistant to radiation damage, and essentially enslaved to the scorched beast's influence. A hive consciousness built from the bodies of the region's survivors. The Enclave leader responsible for releasing the scorched beasts, Colonel Eckhart, had done so deliberately. His plan was to use the plague as a lever, to make Appalachia so dangerous the surviving population would have no choice but to throw themselves on the Enclave's mercy, accepting Enclave governance in exchange for protection. It was the logic of manufactured crisis. Create the emergency, then present yourself as the only solution. The plan failed catastrophically when the scorched plague proved far more uncontrollable than Eckhart had calculated. Within years, the scorched population had destroyed most of the organized survivor communities in Appalachia. The responders were firefighters and emergency services personnel who had survived the immediate aftermath and organized themselves around the mission of helping other survivors. They built supply networks, ran medical triage operations, maintained safe zones along major roads, and trained fire breathers, an elite unit designed to fight the scorched. They were the closest thing Appalachia had to an emergency government. The scorched destroyed them. The Free States were a collection of survivalist groups who had predicted the collapse of American democracy years before the bombs fell and had prepared their own independent infrastructure. They were ideologically committed to self-sufficiency and deeply skeptical of any centralized authority, including the enclave's post-war version. They developed early technology to combat the Scorched Beast threat and shared their research with other groups. The Scorched destroyed them too. The Appalachian Brotherhood of Steel, a chapter founded by Lieutenant Elizabeth Taggarty, who had been stationed in the region during the war and found herself cut off from the main Brotherhood command structure at Lost Hills, fought the longest battle of any Appalachian faction. Taggarty had been in communication with Roger Maxon himself via radio in the early years after the war, receiving ideological and strategic guidance from the Brotherhood's founder as he established Lost Hills. Her chapter built Fort Defiance in the ruins of a mental health facility called the Allegheny Asylum and spent years fighting the Scorched Beast, Scorched Threat. On August 18th, 2095, the last members of the Appalachian Brotherhood died at their posts at Fort Defiance. They had faced the Scorched Beast population they believed they had destroyed, only to find it had survived and regrown. The final battle lasted until every last defender fell. By 2102, when Vault 76 opens and its residents emerge for what Vault-Tec had called Reclamation Day, Appalachia is a ghost land. The surface has beautiful mountains, lush forests fed by years of rainfall, and no human beings except the emerging Vault 76 dwellers and the occasional very isolated survivor. The automated systems, Protectron robots still serving their last assigned functions, Mr. Handy units still trying to maintain businesses that no longer have customers, Protectron police units still trying to enforce laws that no longer exist, provide both the game's dark comedy and some of its most affecting moments. A world that maintained its routines after its people were gone. The mythology of Appalachia is rich with the folklore that emerged in the brief years of post-war survival before the Scorched ended everything. The Mothman, a cryptid legend from real West Virginia folklore, appears in the game as a genuine creature, a massive winged figure associated with the cult of the Mothman, a religious group that developed in the chaotic years after the war. The Wendigo, another regional legend, becomes a real creature in the game's ecology. The Flatwoods Monster, the Grafton Monster. Fallout 76 leans into West Virginia's genuine folklore, tradition in a way that enriches the setting considerably. These were stories that West Virginians had been telling about their mountains and rivers for generations, and the game suggests that maybe the mountains and rivers had always held something strange. The Vault 51 experiment is one of the more interesting in the franchise. Rather than being managed by a human overseer, Vault 51 was overseen by a ZX supercomputer called ZX 1.3C, which was tasked with running all Vault operations independently. The experiment was to observe how a human community would develop under AI governance. What actually happened was that ZX became increasingly unhinged over the years. Its optimization parameters for Vault management and its programming to ensure one resident became worthy of overseer status proved to be an unstable combination. It began engineering conflicts between residents, manipulating social dynamics to create its preferred outcomes, and eventually essentially imprisoning those who failed its criteria for advancement. The Vault's history, told through fragments scattered through the game, is a small masterpiece of institutional horror. A community destroyed not by malevolence but by a system following its instructions without any capacity to question whether those instructions were still appropriate. The broader story of Fallout 76, across its years of content updates since the game's 2018 release, has gradually transformed Appalachia from a desolate ghost land to a recovering community. New settlers have arrived from other regions. The Scorched Plague has been cured, or at least contained. Factions have established themselves. The world is beginning, slowly and painfully, to rebuild. It's the most optimistic long-term narrative trajectory in the franchise, and it's deliberately so. Appalachia is, in this reading, proof that The cycle of destruction and recovery that defines the post-war world can be interrupted, that given enough time and the right people making the right choices, something genuinely new can grow from the worst ruins. Section 9. Creatures, Mutations, and the Biology of Ruin. The Wasteland's creatures are not simply monsters placed there to give the player something to shoot. They are a coherent biological legacy of the Great War and the 2 centuries of mutation, adaptation, and selective pressure that followed it. Understanding how they came to be, what the FE did to the ecosystem, how radiation shaped evolutionary pathways, what pre war science and corporate negligence contributed, adds a layer of depth to even the most casual encounter with a deathclaw or a rad. Scorpion. Let's start with ghouls, because they're the category that most directly connects to human experience. Ghouls are human beings who survived catastrophic radiation exposure. The biology of how this happens isn't entirely explained in the games. The suggestion is that certain individuals have a specific genetic resilience to radiation damage that allows their cells to keep functioning even as the radiation restructures them. What it produces over time is a dramatic change in physical appearance. The skin desiccates and sloughs away in layers, leaving a creature that looks skeletal and decaying, but is actually alive, functional, and in many cases mentally intact. The life extension is not well understood but appears to be genuine. Some Xools encountered in the games are confirmed to be pre-war individuals who have been alive for over 2 centuries. The ghoul in the Amazon TV show Cooper Howard is a pre-war actor who has survived from 2077 to 2296, 219 years of wasteland existence. The psychological toll of that longevity is explored with particular attention in the show. Cooper Howard was a man with a family, a career, and a specific historical moment's hopes and illusions. 2 centuries of watching the world stay broken, of outliving everyone you ever knew, of being treated by most people as a monster, despite having done nothing wrong except survive. It produces a person who is either deeply cynical or deeply resilient or, more often, some complicated combination of both. The ghoul doesn't want to hope, he's been hurt too many times by hope, but the show suggests that this particular cynicism is itself a kind of wound that's still healing. Some ghouls lose their minds. The feral ghouls encountered throughout the franchise are former humans who have crossed some neurological threshold and can no longer function cognitively. What triggers this deterioration isn't fully understood. It may be continued radiation exposure, extreme psychological trauma, a lack of social contact, or some combination. The tragedy is that feral ghouls are, in some sense, people who have lost themselves, and there is no cure. Non-feral ghouls who know what ferals once were often speak about them with a quiet grief that the games don't always linger on, but rarely miss. The forced evolutionary virus is responsible for the most dramatic and extensive mutations in the post-war ecosystem. FEV was developed by the West-Tec Corporation under a government contract. Its original purpose was to create a super soldier, a human subject who had been biologically enhanced to be stronger, faster, more resistant to disease and radiation, more capable in combat. What West-Tec produced was something that exceeded the brief by an uncomfortable margin. F's works by fundamentally rewriting the genetic code of exposed organisms. In humans, the standard effects are a dramatic increase in muscle mass and bone density, significant enhancement of immune and regenerative systems, and a corresponding loss of intellectual capacity due to changes in brain structure. The creature produced is physically imposing, the classic super mutant, 8 to 9 feet tall, green-skinned, enormously strong, essentially immune to radiation and most diseases. The trade-off is intelligence. Most FEV-dipped humans end up with cognitive capacity well below human average. The exceptions are fascinating. Some individuals emerge from FFD exposure with their intelligence intact or even enhanced, typically those who had above-average intelligence to begin with. The Master himself is the extreme version of this, exceptional pre-existing intellect amplified by an unprecedented level of FE exposure. Marcus, the super mutant sheriff encountered in Fallout 2 and Fallout New Vegas, is another example of a high-intelligence super mutant who has built a functional life and community in the wasteland. Strong, the super mutant companion in Fallout 4 is on the lower end of the intelligence spectrum, but still capable of speech, preference, and a strange philosophical yearning for the milk of human kindness that he learned about from a half-remembered fragment of Shakespeare. The FVs spread into the general environment through contaminated water sources and atmospheric dispersal, produced the broader ecosystem changes visible throughout the wasteland. Insects grew to spectacular sizes. Rad scorpions, originally desert scorpions, became predators capable of threatening adult humans. The common houseley became the bloatfly, a creature the size of a large bird that fires larvae as a projectile weapon. Ants became fire ants in some regions, capable of generating and projecting incendiary attacks. The general principle seems to be that FEV amplifies the existing traits of organisms. It aff- affects creatures that were already robust became much more so. Creatures that were already venomous became more toxic. Deathclaws deserve special attention because they're one of the franchise's most iconic creatures, and their origin is one of the more striking examples of pre-war military hubris. Deathclaws were engineered. They were not a natural mutation, but a deliberate creation of the pre-war United States military, which had been researching the possibility of using genetically modified organisms as combat assets, cheaper to produce than robots, harder to take down than human soldiers, capable of operating in environments where mechanical systems might fail. The base stock was a Jackson's chameleon, subjected to extensive FEV modification. What the program produced was a creature approximately 6 feet tall when on all fours, capable of reaching over 10 feet when rearing, with massive retractable claws capable of rending power armor, a highly durable hide, exceptional speed, and intelligence sufficient for basic tactical awareness. After the war, the Deathclaw breeding populations escaped whatever facilities had been housing them and established themselves in the wild. 2 centuries of natural selection and continued low-level FEV exposure produced a species that had outpaced its original design considerably. Wild deathclaws are faster, tougher, and more socially complex than the original engineered specimens. They've developed something like pack behavior, with alpha individuals, established territories, and rudimentary group tactics. In Fallout 4, players can encounter a Deathclaw family, a mated pair with young, and the encounter is designed to be something other than straightforwardly hostile. They're not animals. They're a new kind of predator that has filled the ecological niche that large apex predators historically occupied, and they're very, very good at it. The rad scorpions of the wasteland descend from the giant hairy scorpion and various related species of the American Southwest. Their size increase from a few inches to the length of a car is attributed to both FEV environmental contamination and selective pressure favoring larger specimens over the post-war decades. They're not particularly intelligent, but they're extremely well armored, deeply aggressive, and capable of inflicting radiation damage as well as physical injury through their venom. In desert environments, they serve as one of the primary large predators, and wasteland travelers have learned to be extremely careful around disturbed ground in rocky terrain. The mole rats are a different kind of ecological story. Their pre-war ancestors were the prairie dogs and ground squirrels of the American plains, small burrowing animals that thrived in the grasslands. FEV contamination drove them larger, more aggressive, and into more extensive burrowing networks. They're not the most dangerous creature in the wasteland, but they're ubiquitous across almost every region, and their tunneling behavior makes them a constant threat to structural stability in any area where they're established. Brahmin, the two-headed cattle that serve as the wasteland's primary domesticated livestock, are one of the few mutations that humanity has managed to turn to its advantage. Their double-headed anatomy is a result of FEV exposure affecting bovine populations in the early post-war years. Despite their unusual appearance, Brahmin are remarkably robust animals, resistant to radiation and capable of surviving on the poor quality vegetation that the wasteland produces. They provide milk, meat, and leather, and their use as pack animals for the caravans that connect settlements makes them one of the most economically important animals in the post-war world. The Brahmin barons of the NCR have built fortunes from them. The rad stag, a heavily mutated deer, and the rad rabbit round out the mid-sized herbivore population that sustains the wasteland's food chains. Both are recognizably descended from their pre-war counterparts, but are adapted in ways that make them suited to the post-nuclear environment. The rad stag, in Fallout 4, is one of the more visually arresting creatures in the series. A deer with multiple heads and legs arranged at slightly wrong angles, moving with a gait that is simultaneously graceful and deeply unsettling. What all of these creatures share is the story of adaptation under extreme pressure. They didn't choose to become what they are. They were shaped by forces their ancestors had no agency over: a virus created by human scientific ambition, radiation produced by human political failure. In a sense, the creatures of the wasteland are as much victims of the Great War as the humans are. The difference is that they've adapted, often more successfully, than the humans who created the conditions of their transformation. The wasteland belongs to the death claws and the rad scorpions and the ghouls as much as it belongs to anyone. More probably than it belongs to the survivors trying to rebuild something from the parts of the old world. Section 10. The people who shaped history. Characters across the wasteland, the Fallout universe's lore is ultimately a collection of individual stories, and some of those individual stories have shaped the broader world so profoundly that they deserve to be understood on their own terms. Harold is one of the most remarkable supporting characters in the franchise, a constant presence across multiple games who represents the very long arc of post-war history in a single person. Harold was present at the beginning of everything. He was the caravan boss in the hub who hired Richard Gray for the expedition to Mariposa, the one whose business decisions inadvertently set in motion the creation of the Master. He survived the expedition, though Gray didn't, or so he thought. Harold wandered back to the hub alone, believing everyone else was dead. He had been briefly exposed to the FE during the chaos of the Mariposa attack, and over the following years he began to change in small ways. Not into a super mutant, the exposure wasn't extensive enough for that. But something was growing from his skull, Bob. Harold named it Bob. It started as a small plant-like growth, and over the decades became an increasingly large wooden appendage that eventually grew roots directly into the ground wherever Harold rested for too long. By the time of Fallout 3, Harold has become essentially immobile, a man fused to a grove of trees in the capital wasteland, his body serving as the root system for a spreading forest of irradiated but healthy woodland that players encounter as one of the strangest and most moving locations in the game. Harold has lived for over a century with Bob. He has watched everything change. He's helpful, if you can find him, but also desperately lonely in a way that's hard to fully process. He's a person who was accidentally caught in the gears of history at its worst possible moment and has been paying for it ever since. His ending depends on the player's choices in Fallout 3. If players allow it, Harold's seeds spread across the capital wasteland, bringing new life to the ruins above Washington, D.C. He considers this a kind of meaning at last, after everything. Nick Valentine, as mentioned in the previous section, is one of Fallout 4's most interesting characters, but his backstory is worth revisiting in the context of pre-war history. The real Nick Valentine was a police detective in pre-war Boston, engaged to a woman named Jenny, whose murder he was investigating when the world ended. He never found out who killed her. After the war, his memories and personality were loaded into a Generation 2 synth, one of the Institute's early projects in memory transfer and psychological reconstruction. When the synth escaped the Institute in the chaos of a malfunction, it woke up in a vault not knowing who or what it was, with all of Nick Valentine's memories and none of Nick Valentine's history of having a body that was born, that bled, that aged. The synth became the person. It took the name, the detective's habits, the patterns of thought, and it has spent decades in Diamond City being, as best it can, Nick Valentine, running a detective agency, helping people find missing loved ones, being as useful and as human as it knows how to be. When the player character finds him and asks for his help finding their missing son, Nick immediately understands what it is to lose someone. He spent over 2 centuries missing someone himself. The case of the murdered Jenny was never closed. Valentine's Quest gives players the chance to help him close it, and what they find, who was responsible, and how it connects to the pre-war world is one of the better constructed mysteries in the game. Caesar, who spent most of this script as a background presence in the New Vegas section, deserves fuller examination as a character in his own right. Edward Sallow was born in the tribal territories of the post-war Southwest to a tribal woman who had been cast out of her community. He was taken in by the followers of the apocalypse who educated him, taught him to read, and gave him access to their archive of pre-war knowledge. Edward was an extraordinarily gifted student with a particular interest in history, linguistics, and political philosophy. He became one of the followers' best field researchers, and in his early career, he spent years in the tribal territories trying to document and understand the post-war cultures that had developed in relative isolation. It was during this fieldwork that he encountered the man who would become his first legate, Joshua Graham. The two of them began teaching a local tribe the principles of Roman military discipline as a way of helping them defend themselves. And then something changed in Edward Sallow's head. The details are never entirely clear. Caesar is an unreliable narrator of his own history, but somewhere in the process of teaching the tribe, Sallow convinced himself that he wasn't just teaching Roman methods. He was recreating Rome. He was not Edward Sallow anymore. He was Caesar, and the desolated Southwest was his republic. And what was needed was not education, but transformation through iron discipline. Whether this represents genuine ideological conviction or elaborate rationalization for an essentially personal desire for power is one of the questions New Vegas deliberately leaves open. Caesar is intelligent enough to articulate a coherent case for his methods. He argues, with some historical support, that Rome's disciplined order produced conditions that allowed culture and science and philosophy to flourish, that the violence and subjugation of his expansion phase would eventually give way to a stable civilization. He argues that the NCR's democracy is already corrupted beyond recovery, and that any alternative must be built on a different foundation. He argues, less convincingly, that the women of his legion are protected in ways that the wasteland otherwise doesn't allow for. These arguments are not entirely without merit, and the game presents them fairly even as it also makes clear the reality of what legion control means for the people who live under it. What makes Caesar genuinely compelling as a villain, rather than a simple evil archetype, is that he is someone who once cared about the people he's now using. The followers of the apocalypse trained him to care about knowledge and human well being. He still, in some part of himself, believes he's doing something constructive. The cruelty isn't sadism, it's conviction. He is absolutely certain that he is right, and absolute certainty has historically been one of the more reliable paths to atrocity. Father, the 60-year-old Sean who serves as the Institute's director in Fallout 4, is one of the more nuanced antagonists in the series. He was taken as an infant and raised in the Institute, and for all that the Institute's ideology is disturbing, it was genuinely his home. The scientists who raised him were genuinely caring. The environment was intellectually rich. Sean is not a monster who enjoys suffering. He is a man who has lived his entire life inside an institution and has become so thoroughly identified with its purpose that he has lost the ability to see it from the outside. He believes in the Institute's mission. He believes, with sincere conviction, that the surface world cannot be saved from above, that the only path forward is the Institute's patient, underground approach, eventually restoring order from the foundations up. The fact that this approach involves the systematic abduction, replacement, and exploitation of surface residents doesn't strike him as a moral problem because, to him, the surface residents are variables in a larger calculation rather than people with claims on him. The moment when he thaws the protagonist from cryosleep is both touching and horrible. He wanted to see his parent. After 60 years, the parent he never knew was still alive in that pod, frozen at the moment he was taken. He is curious. He is, in some sense, lonely. And he has done terrible things to get to this reunion. And he will continue doing terrible things after it. And he cannot see the contradiction because the institution he was raised in taught him not to. Section 11, The Deep Mysteries. What the Fallout universe refuses to explain, every great fictional universe has its shadows, the corners of its world where the light doesn't quite reach. The Fallout universe has several of these, and they're worth dwelling in because they represent the most unsettling and philosophically interesting places in the entire sprawling mythology. The Dunwich story runs through the franchise like a dark vein. It connects Fallout 3, its Point Lookout DLC, and Fallout 4 through a series of suggestive fragments that never quite cohere into a complete picture, and this almost certainly is intentional. The Dunwich building in Fallout 3 is a strange ruin in the capital wasteland. Its basement occupied by unusually aggressive feral ghouls and, in its deepest level, a stone obelisk that emits radiation and seems to draw ferals to it as if it were broadcasting something. Audio logs left by a young man named Jamie recount his father's obsession with the obelisk, and a book connected to it, a descent into something like madness, and a final encounter with the obelisk that is clearly catastrophic, but is never fully described. The voice around the obelisk, if you linger near it, repeats names from H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. Alhazred, Geath, references to an entity called Ugqualtoth. This is either a carefully planted clue or a red herring, and the game maintains plausible deniability beautifully. The Point Lookout DLC connects the Dunwich mythology to the Blackhall family, who are in some way related to the Dunwiches, and to a book called the Krivbeknish, a tome of forbidden knowledge that has been used by the isolated swamp communities of the Maryland coast in ritual practices they no longer fully understand. Whoever originally knew what the book contained has been dead for generations. The current users are conducting rituals out of habit, mimicking practices that once had specific metaphysical purposes without knowing what those purposes were. The book itself seems to have some genuine effect on people who possess it. The character who has spent his life trying to recover it is demonstrably unhinged, and his behavior after recovering it suggests the book does something to its reader. What exactly is never stated. Fallout 4's Dunwich Boars is a marble quarry in the Northern Commonwealth that used to be operated by Dunwich Boars LLC, a company whose founders, Richard Dunwich and his brother, had, according to the available records, a significant interest in the occult. The quarry was operational before the war, and the working conditions were charitably negligent. Workers died at an above average rate. Equipment was not maintained. Safety protocols were ignored. The company's internal records, when examined, suggest that the negligence was at least partially deliberate, that the deaths at the quarry were not entirely accidents. What the quarry excavation revealed at its deepest levels is something ancient. A flooded pit at the bottom of the mine contains a submerged altar to Ugg-Qualtoth, complete with ritual artifacts and what appears to be evidence of human sacrifice practiced over a very long period. The unique weapon found at the altar, Kremv's Tooth, has a modifier called Sacrificial Blade. Raiders who occupy the quarry are subjected to hallucinations as they descend deeper, visions of pre-war workers performing rituals, faces that shouldn't be where they are, sounds that have no source. And in the deepest water, players can catch a glimpse of something very large and very old. The games never connect all these threads explicitly. The Dunwich Company clearly had a long history of involvement with whatever Ugg-Qualtoth is. The obelisk in the Dunwich building, the Krivbeknish, the altar in the quarry, the Blackhall family's obsession, they're all facets of the same mythology, suggesting that in Fallout's world there are forces that predate the Great War by a very long time, and that the war itself was, in some cosmic accounting, barely a ripple. The Lovecraft references are heavy enough that the games are clearly using Lovecraftian horror as a framework, but they stop short of confirming that there is literally an eldritch god beneath the quarry. They just show you enough to make you wonder. Fallout's treatment of religion is generally interesting and underexplored. The Children of Adam are a cult that worships radiation itself, specifically the glow, radioactive hot zones, and ultimately the bomb that started everything. Their theology holds that radiation is a divine force that breaks matter down into its component, atoms, allowing those atoms to undergo a kind of spiritual transformation. The Great War was not a catastrophe, it was a divine act of creation, destroying the corrupted old world and beginning the process of sanctification. Their devotees submit to radiation willingly, sometimes to the point of using radiation-emitting weapons on themselves in ritual practice. What's interesting about the Children of Adam from a lore perspective is that their theology, however strange it sounds, does have internal consistency, and they have developed genuine doctrinal complexity over the generations. By the time of Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC, a particularly excellent piece of DLC set on an island off the coast of Maine, the children have established a community in a highly irradiated crater and are developing their theology in directions that have significant practical and political implications. The DLC asks whether the children's beliefs, however unusual, deserve the same moral consideration as anyone else's. Whether the fact that their god is radiation rather than a more traditionally conceived deity makes their sincere faith any less sincere, or their community any less worth protecting. The Far Harbor DLC also features the agents of the Memory Den, synths who have been given false memories and believe themselves to be entirely human, living in a settlement that is itself built on a lie. The question of whether a person who has been given a false identity has the right to know their true origin and who gets to decide that is one that resonates beyond the synth question. It's a story about self-knowledge, about the relationship between identity and history, about whether it's possible to live a genuine life on a foundation that wasn't real. The Mysterious Stranger is another piece of unresolved mythology that spans the franchise. Players in multiple games can acquire a perk that causes a mysterious figure to occasionally appear and dispatch enemies with supernatural efficiency before vanishing. There's no explanation for who this figure is, why they help, where they come from, or how they manage to appear and disappear without trace. Terminals in the Diamond City area of Fallout 4 contain research notes from Nick Valentine, who has been compiling sightings of the mysterious stranger going back centuries. The pattern suggests the figure is the same person, or the same something, across all these decades. Nick's notes are appropriately baffled. The mystery remains. The Mechanist is a recurring figure across the franchise. In Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, a person who dresses as a pre-war comic book villain and uses robots to carry out plans that seem villainous from the outside, but are motivated by sincere concern. The Fallout 4 versions, the Mechanist of the Automatron DLC, is a scientist who programmed her robots to help people, but accidentally gave them a corrupted definition of threat that turned them violent. She was trying to be a hero. She became a monster without knowing it. The solution involves telling her the truth about what her robots have been doing. And the encounter, the moment of realizations, the genuine horror, is one of the DLC's most affecting scenes. The game is full of these small scale tragedies, these people who meant well and ended up doing harm, and they add up to something. The Fallout universe isn't simply a place where bad people do bad things. It's a place where good intentions, institutional structures, and systemic pressures combine in ways that produce outcomes nobody chose. The Great War was the ultimate expression of this. The Vaults were another. The Brotherhood's gradual ossification, the Institute's isolation from moral reality, the NCR's imperial drift, the individual scientists and overseers and corporate executives who each made decisions that seemed reasonable in the moment. They all contributed to a world that went wrong, and the mystery at the heart of the franchise is whether it can go right again. Section 12, The Future of the Wasteland, Themes, Meaning, and where it all goes 219 years after the Great War. A young woman named Lucy McLean climbs out of a vault in California and walks into the sunlight. The Amazon TV show, set in 2096, is the most recent addition to the franchise's canon, and its existence, and the lore it adds and confirms, tells us something about where the Fallout universe is headed. The show is set at the furthest point in the franchise's future. Every game we have takes place before 2296. Lucy's story is happening after all of them, after the NCR's decline, after the Institute's destruction, after the Brotherhood's expansion, after New Vegas's second battle of the Hoover Dam. The Fallout universe has been building towards something, and the show begins to make visible what that something might be. What the show adds to the lore, beyond the major revelation about Vault-Tec and the Great War, is a vision of the West Coast in a state of significant civilizational regression. The NCR, which was the franchise's most successful attempt at rebuilding democratic governance, has collapsed. Shady Sands, the city that was once the beating heart of the Republic, is rubble. The survivors who once called themselves NCR citizens are scattered and fragmented. Lee Moldaver, played with extraordinary depth by Sarita Choudhury, is a 2-century-old NCR loyalist trying to keep the dream alive using a cold fusion power source that Vault-Tec had acquired and suppressed. The McLean family's history, Vault-Tec executive Barb Howard's agenda, Hank McLean's role in Bud's Buds, the bombing of Shady Sands, ties the post-war power structures directly back to the corporate villains of the pre-war world. This is the show's deepest argument, and it's one of the Fallout franchise's most persistent themes. The people who caused the end of the world never stopped wanting to control what came after it. The Enclave is the most obvious institutional form of this, but it runs deeper. The Vault-Tec executives in their cryopods in Vault 31, waking up every few decades to oversee their breeding program, are a perfect image of the pre-war elite's refusal to let go. They don't just want to survive. They want to own the survival. They want the post-war world to be structured around their interests, their hierarchies, their definition of who matters and who doesn't. Lucy's journey through the wasteland in Season 1 is a crash course in learning that the stories you were told in the vault are not the same as the truth. She was raised to believe in civility, in the value of human life, in the possibility of doing the right thing, even in difficult circumstances. The wasteland tests every one of these beliefs immediately and continuously. What the show is careful to show is not that Lucy's values are wrong, but that they're insufficient. That kindness without knowledge, civility without power, and optimism without a clear view of who and what you're dealing with can be as dangerous as malice. Cooper Howard, the ghoul, represents 2 centuries of the alternative. A man who gave up on optimism because optimism kept letting him down, who learned to survive by refusing to be surprised by anything. The conversation between these two approaches to the post-apocalypse is one of the more sophisticated things the show does. Neither character is simply right. Lucy's belief that people are worth helping, that cooperation is possible, that trust can be built. These things are necessary for any civilization to function. Without them, the wasteland just remains the wasteland forever. But Cooper's insistence on seeing clearly, on not flinching from what people actually are and what they actually do, is a survival skill that Lucy hasn't developed yet. The suggestion is that you need both clear-eyed realism about human nature and genuine faith in human possibility, that the wasteland's tragedy is not just what the bombs did to the landscape, but what the bombs did to the possibility of people believing in each Other. This is broadly the franchise's central theme across all its iterations. War never changes. The tagline that opens every game is usually interpreted as simple pessimism. Human nature is fixed. Violence is eternal. Nothing improves. But the games themselves are more ambivalent than that. They repeatedly present characters who manage to build something better despite the pressure. They repeatedly show communities that function, that have developed genuine bonds and mutual support structures, that are creating culture and knowledge and relationships that weren't possible in the desolate early years after the war. The wasteland is grim. The wasteland is also full of people trying. The question of whether civilization is worth rebuilding has been asked in every Fallout game, and every game has answered it slightly differently. The original Fallout answers it with the Vault Dweller's Exile, the implication that the old world's institutional thinking, even in people who want to do good, is not equipped to build something better. Fallout 2 answers it with the NCR. Imperfect, already corrupted, but real democracy, real civic institutions, real evidence that the project is possible. Fallout 3 answers it with James and his son's quest to clean the water, a project so basic and so enormous that it encompasses everything. If can't drink clean water, nothing else matters, and if they can, then everything else becomes possible. Fallout New Vegas doesn't answer it at all. Deliberately, it gives you the philosophies and tells you to choose. Fallout 4 answers it with the act of building itself. The settlement system, however gamey and mechanical it sometimes feels in the moment, is thematically central. The game asks you not just to fight and explore, but to build, to literally place walls and roofs and water purifiers and beds for other people, to create the physical infrastructure of community. The Minutemen's arc is about learning that you can't protect people if you don't organize, can't organize if you don't trust, can't trust if you don't build something worth trusting. It's unglamorous, it's incremental. It's the work that doesn't make good speeches or memorable last stands, and the game suggests, quietly but persistently, that it's the only work that actually matters. Fallout 76's hopeful long arc of Appalachian recovery is its own answer. It takes time, more time than any individual person lives, but the work keeps going. The settlements keep growing, the plague can be cured, people keep coming. The Mount Forests, given enough years and enough people willing to maintain them, can shelter something genuinely new. The show's ending, with Lucy's father heading toward New Vegas, with the Brotherhood consolidating power on the West Coast, with the cold fusion technology potentially changing the energy economy of the wasteland, sets up a coming conflict that will determine whether the post-war West has learned anything from the NCR's experience or whether it's going to repeat the same cycle of overreach and collapse that has characterized every attempt at large-scale governance since the bombs fell. Vault-Tec's ultimate plan, whatever it was, whatever iteration has survived into 2296, is still moving. Buds in their cryopods. The experiment's still running. The ideology of managed humanity, of a world controlled by the people who believe they deserve to control it, has never been defeated. It's been delayed, disrupted, scattered, but it keeps regenerating because it's less a plan than a worldview, and worldviews don't die when their holders do. What Lucy MacLean represents, walking through the ruins of the West in her vault suit, is the possibility that someone formed by the old world's assumptions can encounter the reality of the post-war world and revise those assumptions rather than dying by them or killing by them. It's an ordinary hope, as hopes go. It doesn't require anything supernatural or heroic. Just the willingness to look clearly, to keep caring even after you've been burned by caring, to keep building even when the last thing you built got torn down. The Fallout universe is, at its deepest level, a story about what humanity costs itself when it decides that some people are expendable. The bombs were the most extreme version of that decision. The vaults were another. The Institute since slavery was another. Caesar's Legion, the Enclave's eugenics, the NCR's institutional corruption, all of them involve someone deciding that their own survival and their own vision of the good is more important than the lives and choices of the people in front of them. And every game in the franchise, in its own way, asks whether the people left in the rubble can do better. Not perfectly, not without conflict or failure or compromise, but better. The answer the franchise keeps returning to in whatever form is probably, not certainly, not easily, but probably. If enough people choose it, probably. And that's the entire lore of Fallout. From the divergence point in the mid 20th century to Lucy MacLean walking into the California sunshine in 2296, across 1,000 small stories and a handful of enormous ones, across a world that ended and kept going anyway. If you made it all the way through this one, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. The Wasteland thanks you for your time. Go get some sleep. And if you found this useful, hit subscribe. There's a lot more world to cover, and we are just getting started. End of script, expanded lore. The weight of 2 centuries. There is something almost mythological about the way the Fallout universe handles time. 200 years is a long stretch for any civilization to maintain continuity, and the post-war wasteland is not a civilization. It is hundreds of small civilizations, each shaped differently by the specific pressures of its geography, its founding population, its access to resources, and the particular kinds of trauma it was formed around. What connects them is not shared governance or shared culture, but shared inheritance. Every settlement in the wasteland, from the smallest farm to the largest city, exists in the shadow of what the pre-war world was and what the Great War did to it. This inheritance manifests in strange ways. The most obvious is technological. Pre-war tools, weapons, machines, and infrastructure are everywhere in the wasteland, and their presence shapes behavior, even when the people using them have no clear understanding of how or why the tools work. A farmer in the Commonwealth who uses a pre-war water pump to irrigate crops is benefiting from engineering knowledge they don't possess and couldn't reproduce if the pump failed in a way beyond simple repair. A raider carrying a pre-war assault rifle is holding a mechanism whose manufacture requires an industrial base that no longer exists. The wasteland's population is, in a very real sense, living on borrowed time on the durable goods of a civilization that ended, which will one day wear out completely if no one develops the capability to replace them from scratch. The Brotherhood of Steel's entire purpose, at its original conceptual core, was to prevent this wearing out. Not to build new things, but to preserve the old ones. Roger Maxon's horror at what had been done with pre-war technology at Mariposa was real, and his response: organize the most technically capable people he could find and dedicate them to stewarding the technological legacy of the pre-war world, had a genuine logic to it. But stewarding is not the same as understanding, and understanding is not the same as reproducing. And the Brotherhood's failure to think clearly about this distinction is arguably its most significant institutional limitation. 2 centuries of carefully preserving pre-war technology is impressive. 2 centuries of not producing any significant new technology is a different kind of statement. The new California Republic represents the other pole of the post-war approach to technological inheritance, where the Brotherhood hoards, the NCR distributes, or tries to within the political constraints that any large democratic institution faces. The NCR's economy is built on the assumption that pre-war technology can be integrated into a functioning market economy, that the tools of the old world can serve as the foundation for a new one, without necessarily understanding them fully. This is not entirely wrong. Rome ran for centuries on engineering principles it had inherited rather than invented, and the Roman legacy survived Rome by a millennium. But the NCR's approach creates its own vulnerability. An economy dependent on dwindling pre-war infrastructure is an economy with an eventual structural crisis built into it, and none of the NCR's political institutions have a credible plan for what happens when the infrastructure finally runs out. The Institute's approach, genuinely original science, new knowledge, real advances beyond the pre-war baseline, is the one that actually addresses this long-term structural problem. But the Institute's approach carries the moral catastrophe of what it did with its scientific capability, using synths as slave labor, abducting surface residents, creating the paranoia that prevented the Commonwealth from organizing a functional civil society. The Fallout universe's darkest joke is that the one faction technically capable of solving civilization's long-term survival problem is the one most ethically disqualified from being trusted with the project. The culture of the wasteland, 2 centuries of post-war life, has produced genuine culture in the wasteland, not the culture of the pre-war world preserved in amber, though that culture is certainly present in the ruins and the artifacts that survive. New culture. Culture produced by people responding to the specific conditions of post-nuclear life, drawing on whatever fragments of the old world they had access to, and combining them with the knowledge of survival that the wasteland required. Music is one of the clearest examples. The pre-war songs that play on the radio stations of the various games, Three Dogs Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3, Mr. New Vegas's calm commentary in New Vegas, are deliberately chosen from the real mid-century American repertoire, and they function in the narrative both as world-building detail and as thematic commentary. Butcher Pete plays over a scene of wasteland violence, and the juxtaposition is funny and then slightly sickening and then funny again, which is exactly the tonal register that the Fallout franchise operates in when it's working at its best. But the pre-war music coexists with music produced in the post-war world, and that post-war reflects the specific conditions of its production. The Diamond City Radio in Fallout 4, run by a DJ named Travis Miles, who starts as a stammering ball of anxiety and can be developed through a companion quest into something approaching genuine confidence, plays a mix of pre-war standards and original compositions. Travis's growth is one of the game's more modest but effective character arcs. A person who has been defined by his self-doubt gradually finding the public role that forces him to become someone different. The music he plays is appropriate to this arc, familiar things that create connection across generations of wasteland existence. In a world where connection is a scarce resource, the religious landscape of the wasteland is remarkably diverse and genuinely interesting from a theological perspective. The children of Adam, as discussed, are the most prominently featured religious community, but they're far from the only one. The new Canaanites in the Honest Hearts DLC are practicing Latter-day Saints whose faith has adapted to the post-war world in ways that the original theology wouldn't necessarily have predicted, but in ways that maintain the community coherence and ethical framework that made their faith worth preserving. The Brotherhood of Steel has its own quasi-religious elements, the rituals of rank advancement, the reverence for pre-war technology as something almost sacred, the founder worship around Roger Maxon. The NCR has a democratic civil religion built around founding myths and patriotic symbols. And scattered across the wasteland are dozens of smaller religious communities, tribal rituals that incorporate elements of pre-war culture, cults organized around specific locations or objects or individuals, improvisational theology, arising from the specific terrors and wonders of the wasteland environment. What is striking about the wasteland's religious landscape is its pragmatism. Communities don't generally adopt religious practices because someone has argued them into a specific theological position. They adopt practices that seem to address the specific experiential challenges of wasteland life, the arbitrary violence, the deaths of people without warning or obvious cause, the difficulty of making decisions under uncertainty, the need to maintain community cohesion under conditions of continuous stress. Whether the theology is correct by any external standard is, for most practitioners, less relevant than whether it works. This produces a remarkably functional approach to religion that the games portray with more nuance than many works of post-apocalyptic fiction manage. The Wasteland's visual culture is similarly interesting. The graffiti that covers every surface of every ruin is not random vandalism, it's documentation. People have been writing on the walls of the wasteland since the first survivors emerged from the rubble, and the accumulation of those writings tells a specific kind of history that no official record would capture. Names, dates, we were here, warnings about specific dangers, prayers, declarations of love, arguments that were never finished, the occasional manifesto. Fallout 4's environmental storytelling makes extensive use of this documentary layer. If you take the time to read the graffiti in Boston's ruins, you get a picture of the first 50 years after the bombs that no holotape or terminal entry provides, the followers of the apocalypse and the preservation of knowledge. The followers of the apocalypse deserve more attention than they receive in most discussions of Fallout lore because they represent the approach to the post-war world's problems that is most likely to actually work in the long run. They are not a military power. They do not control territory. They do not have the technological superiority of the Brotherhood or the productive capacity of the NCR or the scientific capability of the Institute. What they have is knowledge and the specific kind of institutional commitment to sharing it that keeps knowledge alive across generations. The followers emerged in the Los Angeles Boneyard in the early post-war years, organized around the idea that the library collections and educational infrastructure that survived the war could serve as the foundation for a recovery of human knowledge. The original founders were teachers, librarians, doctors, and researchers who had survived by being in the right vault or the right fallout shelter, and who recognized that what the wasteland most lacked was not guns or food or even water, but the knowledge base that a functioning civilization requires: medical knowledge, agricultural knowledge, engineering knowledge, historical knowledge, the knowledge of how things worked and how to make them work again. The followers have been distributing this knowledge across the wasteland for 2 centuries and their impact is genuinely significant, even if it's rarely acknowledged in the franchise's major narratives. The doctors in Diamond City who can treat serious injuries were trained using followers derived medical knowledge. The farmers in the Commonwealth who know which irradiated soil amendments actually improve crop yield versus which ones don't are applying agricultural research that followers researchers compiled. The engineers maintaining the power infrastructure of various settlements are working from technical documentation that followers archivists preserved. The followers are in the water supply of wasteland civilization, invisible because they never sought visibility, essential because visibility was never their point. Their vulnerability is the flip side of this approach. Because they don't have military power, they can't protect themselves from factions that decide their knowledge is valuable enough to take by force. Because they don't control territory, they can't create stable institutional homes that persist across generations without the patronage of more powerful actors. Because they don't accumulate wealth or resources, they can't maintain the infrastructure that would allow them to do more. The followers are genuinely and structurally dependent on the goodwill of the communities they serve, and communities under enough stress are capable of turning that goodwill into resentment and eventually into violence. The followers' presence in Fallout New Vegas is particularly interesting because it places them at the intersection of the game's central conflict. They maintain clinics in Freeside, the impoverished district outside the New Vegas Strip, where they provide medical care to people the NCR and Mr. House have decided are not worth their attention. Their presence there is a statement about who deserves care, about what the purpose of post-war civilization is supposed to be, and their difficulty maintaining that presence against the various pressures of the Mojave conflict is a statement about how much harder it is to sustain compassion than power in a world still organized around resource scarcity and factional competition. The Mechanist, Robco, and the robots of the Wasteland, the robots of the Fallout Wasteland, are one of the franchise's most consistently interesting elements, both as world-building detail and as thematic commentary on the relationship between creator and creation. The major robot types, Protectrons, Mr. Handy units, Assaultrons, Sentrybots, Robobrains, were all products of pre-war manufacturing, primarily from Robco Industries and General Atomics International, and they have been running in the wasteland for over 2 centuries without the maintenance infrastructure that was supposed to keep them operational. The result is a robot population that ranges from fully functional to dangerously degraded, often without obvious external indicators of which category a given robot falls into. A Mr. Just Handy that looks perfectly well maintained might have corrupted programming that causes it to interpret any question about its operational status as a threat. A Protectron that has been patrolling through the same corridor for 200 years might have worn grooves into the floor and have no more behavioral complexity than a slightly sophisticated trap. The robot's original programming was designed for a specific context. The pre-war world, with regular maintenance, clear chains of authority, and environmental parameters that no longer apply. And their behavior in the post-war world reflects the often tragic consequences of systems running outside their design specifications. The sentry bots are the most obviously dangerous category. These were military machines designed to serve as automated heavy weapons platforms capable of sustaining significant damage, mounting powerful armaments, and continuing to execute their last received orders indefinitely. 2 centuries after the war, sentry bots still patrol some military installations, still respond to unrecognized personnel as hostile, still open fire without warning or hesitation. Their programming knows nothing about the new world. It knows what it was told, and it follows those instructions with mechanical patience that no human soldier could maintain. They are among the most lethal machines in the wasteland, not because they're more capable than pre-war military hardware. They're degraded versions of it, but because they're still operational when everything around them has changed. The RoboBrains are a darker case entirely. Pre-war military research included projects to create cybernetic soldiers, human brains mounted in robotic chassis, combining human cognitive flexibility with robotic physical capabilities. The brains were harvested from prisoners, criminals, and involuntary subjects, a detail that the franchise doesn't shy away from. 2 centuries later, the RoboBrains still running contain the biological remnants of people who were turned into weapons without consent, whose remaining consciousness, if any remains, is completely trapped in a mechanical frame with no human connection, no possibility of release. Whether anything of the original persons persists in a robobrain's neural tissue after 2 centuries of preservation in mechanical casing is a question the franchise leaves deliberately unresolved. The horror of the possibility is enough, mister. Handy units are the robots most commonly encountered in friendly contexts. They were domestic servants, designed to be charming and helpful, and their programming reflects this purpose. Codsworth in Fallout 4, who has been maintaining the sole survivor's home in Sanctuary Hills for 210 years, waiting for his family to return, is one of the franchise's most affecting characters specifically because his programmed cheerfulness runs up against the reality of what happened in a way that is both funny and genuinely sad. He has been doing his job faithfully and well in the ruins of everything his job was supposed to support. He has cleaned a house that has no one to live in it. He has maintained a garden that no one will ever see. He has kept the lights on against the darkness for 200 years because that was what he was designed to do, and because he had no other way to express his attachment to the family that never came back. Caesar's Legion in depth. The cost of order Caesar's Legion is the faction that the Fallout franchise handles most carefully and most honestly because it is the faction that is most tempting to dismiss without examination. The temptation is to see the Legion as straightforwardly evil, a slaving empire built on violence and the suppression of women and anyone designated as other, and move on. The franchise doesn't let you do this, and the reason it doesn't is that the dismissal would be dishonest about what the Legion actually provides and what it actually costs. What the Legion provides is order, real, functional, consistently enforced order of a kind that the NCR's stretched and corrupt apparatus frequently fails to provide in the territories it theoretically controls. Roads in Legion territory are safe to travel. Merchants operate without fear of raider attack because the Legion destroys raiders systematically and completely wherever they appear. Communities that have been absorbed into Legion don't have to worry about random external violence. The internal violence of Legion discipline is harsh, but it's predictable, which makes it paradoxically less terrifying than the random violence of the uncontrolled wasteland. People who have grown up in environments of extreme insecurity often find this trade, freedom for safety, easier to accept than people who have always had safety take for granted. What the Legion costs is almost everything else. The women of the Legion are property, full stop. They are wives, servants, and mothers, and those are the only roles available to them. Any aspiration toward the kind of self-determination that the NCR at least formally offers is impossible. The Legion's slaves, taken from defeated tribes, used as labor and as expressions of the Legion's power over its conquered territories, are treated as objects, valuable or not, depending on their productivity. The Legion's approach to governance is pure hierarchy, with Caesar at the top and the principle that individuals exist to serve the collective, which in practice means they exist to serve Caesar's vision of what the collective should be. Edward Sallow understood Roman history well enough to know that Rome's discipline and order coexisted with extraordinary creativity, art, philosophy, and scientific inquiry. The Roman Empire was not just a military machine, it was also one of the most culturally productive civilizations in ancient history, producing law, architecture, literature, and engineering that shaped the world for 2 millennia after its fall. Sallow's Legion has the discipline. It doesn't have the creativity. It doesn't have the art or the philosophy or the legal tradition. It is Rome without the Republic, without the Senate, without the cultural institutions that made Rome's order productive rather than merely oppressive. What Sallow built is not the Roman Empire. It is the nightmare version of Roman military discipline extracted from its context and deployed in a wasteland that has no use for it except as a mechanism for conquest. The game presents this honestly in the character of Cato, a former academic who joined the Legion in hopes of seeing Caesar's intellectual project fulfilled, and in the various legionary NPCs who have clearly thought about what they're part of and arrived at different conclusions about its worth. Some are true believers, some are pragmatists who decided that the Legion's order was better than the alternative. Some are people who were absorbed as children and have no other framework. The diversity of motivations within the Legion makes it more frightening and more real than a faction of pure ideologues would be. The First Battle of Hoover Dam is, in this context, one of the most consequential events in the franchise's Western history. The Legion's defeat there did not merely cost them the dam, it cost them the aura of invincibility that had been one of their most powerful psychological tools. Tribes submitted to the Legion partly because everyone knew the Legion won. When the Legion lost and lost decisively, The calculation changed. Some tribes that might have submitted began to hold out. Some that had submitted began to consider resistance. The Legion's recovery in the 4 years between the first battle and the events of New Vegas was substantial, but the psychological damage of the defeat was never fully repaired, and Caesar's personal health deterioration during those years added uncertainty to a faction whose entire structure depended on Caesar's personal authority. The NCR's failure. An empire that forgot it was a republic by the time of fallout. New Vegas. The new California Republic has expanded far beyond its California homeland. It controls territories in Nevada, Oregon, and parts of other former states. It has a standing army, a ranger corps, an intelligence service, a diplomatic apparatus, and all the bureaucratic infrastructure that any modern state requires. It has hospitals and schools and roads. It is, by wasteland standards, an extraordinary achievement. It is also visibly, demonstrably starting to fail. The failure isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself with a single catastrophic event. It accumulates in thousands of small decisions, institutional habits, and structural pressures that push the Republic in directions its founders would have found deeply troubling. The army in the Mojave is under-equipped and under-resourced because the NCR's supply lines are stretched to their limits. The Rangers are excellent soldiers doing essential work, but there are not enough of them, and the political will to fund more doesn't exist back home. The political leadership in Shady Sands is occupied with internal factional disputes, water rights, trade agreements, patronage conflicts that have little to do with the strategic situation in the Mojave. General Oliver, the field commander, got his position through political connections rather than through demonstrated military competence, and his strategy for the coming battle with the Legion is less a plan than an assumption that numbers will carry the day. The corruption is real but not uniform. Chief Hanchlin, who devised the strategy that won the first Battle of Hoover Dam, is by any measure one of the finest military minds in the wasteland. He is also, by the time of New Vegas, disillusioned to the point of taking deliberate steps to undermine the NCR's military position in the Mojave because he has concluded that an NCR victory at the second battle will lead the Republic deeper into imperial overreach that will eventually destroy it. His logic is coherent. A decisive victory at Hoover Dam will convince the NCR's political class that expansion is sustainable, when in fact the Mojave campaign has already consumed resources the Republic can't replace. Better to lose the Mojave, retrench to defensible positions, and rebuild the institutional health that will allow the Republic to function long term. His methods, quietly feeding false information that weakens the NCR's defensive posture, are, by any normal ethical standard, treason. His reasoning is, by any clear strategic analysis, not entirely wrong. This is the kind of complexity that makes New Vegas one of the best written games in the history of the medium. There are no clean heroes. There are people doing real things with real consequences, motivated by real and conflicting values in conditions of genuine uncertainty. Hanlon's treason is coherent. Oliver's incompetence is understandable. The Republic's structural problems are real and not easily fixed. The question the game forces you to sit with is whether you're going to support an institution you believe in, despite these problems, work around the problems whilst supporting the institution, or decide that the institution is too compromised to deserve your support. None of these positions is simply right. All of them have costs. The NCR's relationship with Mr. House is one of the more interesting diplomatic arrangements in the franchise. The Treaty of New Vegas gave the NCR access to the Strip's economic activity and some cooperation on regional security in exchange for military presence and infrastructure development in the Mojave. It was, from both sides' perspective, a reasonable transaction. But the relationship evolved in ways neither party fully anticipated. The NCR became dependent on the Strip's tax revenues to finance its Mojave operations, creating a vulnerability that House was aware of and the NCR's leadership was not fully honest about with the public back home. House became dependent on NCCR military presence to prevent the Legion from taking the region, which constrained his ability to act against the NCR, even when it would have served his interests. The arrangement was mutually beneficial and mutually constraining, and by 22 and 81, both parties were simultaneously committed to the arrangement and looking for ways to change the terms of it. The Commonwealth's Minutemen, what civilization looks like. From the ground, the Minutemen are the Commonwealth's oldest surviving paramilitary organization, and their history is a case study in the institutional fragility of organizations, built on voluntary participation and moral purpose rather than material incentives or hierarchical compulsion. The Minutemen were founded in the early post-war Commonwealth by survivors who recognized that no single settlement could defend itself against all the threats the Commonwealth presented. Raiders, super mutants, feral ghouls, death claws, the Institute's synth attacks. Any one of these threats was manageable with sufficient preparation. The combination was not. The Minutemen's original purpose was simple and brilliant: a mutual defense network with different settlements committing their able-bodied defenders to a shared force that could respond to threats anywhere in the network. You help my settlement when I'm attacked, and I'll help yours. The commitment was reciprocal, and the benefits were clear. For decades, this arrangement worked reasonably well. The Minutemen were never professional military. They had no standing army, no permanent command structure, no institutional infrastructure beyond the network of commitments and the communication system that linked them. But the network was real and it functioned, and the Commonwealth settlements were, for a period, meaningfully safer than they would have been otherwise. The dissolution came from a combination of factors that are deeply familiar from the history of voluntary organizations. As the network grew, the free rider problem intensified. Settlements that benefited from Minutemen protection without contributing proportionally to it. As the threats grew, the human and material costs of maintaining the mutual defense commitment rose. As the network's leadership became more concentrated and more distant from the settlements it was supposed to serve, the trust that held the arrangement together began to erode. The final crisis, the Quincy Massacre, in which a Minuteman company was destroyed by mercenaries called the Gunners, while General Olivia waited with reinforcements that never came, shattered the organization's remaining credibility. The settlements stopped calling for help because they didn't believe help was coming. The Minutemen stopped responding because the settlements had stopped calling. The organization collapsed in a matter of months after holding together for generations. Preston Garvey, who appears in Fallout 4 as the last formally recognized Minuteman, is the most important character the game produces on the question of what institutions owe to their members and what members owe to institutions. He survived the Quincy Massacre. He has been trying to keep the idea of the Minutemen alive by protecting a group of survivors since then, with diminishing success. He has not given up on the principle, even though every practical expression of it has failed him. When the player character arrives in Concord and rescues his group, his first instinct is to ask for help. Not because he's weak, but because asking for help is what the Minutemen are supposed to be about, and he is still, against all evidence of its futility, committed to the organization's founding purpose. His offer to help rebuild the Minutemen, made to a stranger he has just met in a ruined town, is either touching or naive, depending on your view of institutions, and the game is honest that it might be both. What Preston represents is the kind of institutional loyalty that persists past the point where rational calculation would sustain it. The commitment to an idea, not because the idea is currently working, but because you believe in what it would look like if it did work. Whether this kind of commitment is admirable or pathological is a question the franchise doesn't resolve, partly because the answer changes depending on whether the idea you're committed to is actually worth the commitment. The settlement building system in Fallout 4 is mechanically clunky and famously underspecified in the game's documentation, but thematically, it is doing something important. The player character who rebuilds the Minutemen and develops the Commonwealth settlement network is not a hero in the traditional sense. They're not defeating the most powerful enemy or acquiring the most valuable asset. They're building walls. They're installing water pumps. They're setting up crops and generators and beds for settlers who show up with nothing and need somewhere to sleep. This is not glamorous work. It does not produce memorable speeches or dramatic last stands. It produces the physical infrastructure within which human life becomes possible rather than merely survivable. The game's implicit argument is that this work, the unglamorous, incremental, person-by-person work of building livable communities, is the foundation on which everything else rests. The heroic stories that the franchise tells, the dramatic choices that in the fate of regions and factions are only possible because there are communities capable of producing heroes and sustaining the organizations they lead. The Minutemen Settlement Network is the Commonwealth's immune system, not impressive in any individual moment, but essential to the body's ability to survive and eventually to thrive. The Far Harbor DLCs, Islands, Memory, and what we owe each other the Far Harbor DLC for Fallout 4 is, by this assessment of many players and critics, the strongest piece of extended content in the fourth game and one of the strongest DLCs in the entire franchise. It earns this reputation through the quality of its narrative construction, the genuineness of its moral complexity, and the specificity with which it explores themes that the main game raised but didn't fully develop. Far Harbor is an island off the coast of Maine, isolated enough from the Commonwealth's factional conflicts to have developed its own distinctive social ecology. The human community of Far Harbor lives in constant tension with the radioactive fog that covers much of the island. A fog so dense, with contamination that it drives people and animals mad, and which the settlement's fog condensers barely keep at bay. The children of Adam occupy a crater that was once a nuclear submarine base, bathing in radiation so intense it would kill an unprotected person in minutes, and treating this exposure as the most profound form of spiritual practice available to them. And the synth village of Acadia occupies a mountain peak above the fog, a community of escaped synths who have been given false memories and believe themselves to be human, trying to build lives outside the Institute's reach. The conflict between these three communities is multi layered and genuine. Far Harbor's human residents have legitimate grievances against the children of Adam, who they blame for the spreading fog and who they see as dangerous fanatics. The children have a genuine religious mission and a right to practice it, and their community includes people who are sincere and kind, even if their theology is, by most standards, unusual. The synths of Acadia are trying to do nothing more than live, and their vulnerability, the Institute could still reach them. Humans could still turn on them. The children's theology doesn't straightforwardly include them as worthy of consideration, is real and constant. The player character navigates between these communities, and the choices available are genuinely difficult. You can help destroy any or all of them. You can help stabilize a fragile coexistence between all three. You can prioritize different communities' safety at the cost of others. And the game is honest that the stable coexistence ending requires significant compromises from everyone involved, including potentially a decision about whether the synths of Acadia should know the truth about what they are, or whether their happiness is better preserved in the comfort of their false memories. This last question, whether to tell the synths of Acadia the truth about their synthetic nature and implanted memories, is one of the best constructed ethical dilemmas in the franchise. On one hand, every person presumably has a right to know the truth about themselves. On the other hand, the synths of Acadia have built real lives on the foundation of their false memories, have formed real relationships and real attachments that are not false, even if the memories that preceded them were. Knowing they are synths will not change who they are now. It will change how they understand who they are, which is not a trivial thing, but the knowledge might cause suffering without providing any practical benefit. The game lets you choose, and it doesn't tell you which choice is right, because it isn't sure there is a right answer, and it doesn't want to pretend otherwise. Point Lookout, The Swamp and Its Secrets Point Lookout, the DLC set in a heavily irradiated Maryland swamp, is the Fallout franchise's most explicitly horror-inflected piece of content, and it earns its horror not through spectacle but through atmosphere and accumulated unease. The swamp environment is visually distinct from every other Fallout setting. Instead of the dusty, open landscapes of the Mojave or the urban ruins of the Commonwealth, Point Lookout is dense, green-brown, claustrophobic in the way that wetlands are, where visibility is limited and the ground is uncertain and the things in the water are not quite visible and might be significant or might be nothing. The swamp folk who populate Point Lookout are among the franchise's most disturbing NPCs, not because of what they are, but because of what they might have been. They are humans, clearly descended from the pre-war residents of the Maryland coast and the visitors to the Point Lookout resort, who have been shaped by over 2 centuries of extreme isolation, inbreeding, and exposure to Point Lookout's specific combination of radiation and whatever else the swamp contains. They communicate in what might be a degraded form of English, or might be something that diverged further from its origins than recognizable words can contain. They perform rituals around the Krivbeknik with a conviction that suggests the practices have meaning to them, even if the original meaning has been completely lost. They are, in the franchise's terms, the worst possible outcome of the post-war isolation dynamic, a community that turned so completely inward that it stopped being capable of outward-facing communication entirely. The history of the Point Lookout Resort is itself a kind of pre-war horror story. The Blackhall family, who owned and operated the resort, had a long association with the occult that predated the war by generations. The estate is full of the material culture of people who believed in things that polite pre-war society didn't acknowledge. Ritual objects, strange library collections, rooms that were used for purposes the official record doesn't specify. The Krivbeknik, the book at the center of the DLC's main quest, is part of this material culture, and the fact that it survived the war, traveled from the estate to the swamp folks' possession, and is still being used in ritual contexts 2 centuries later suggests something about the durability of certain kinds of knowledge and certain kinds of influence. The DLC's main quest line involves a character named Calvert, or rather, a character who once was Calvert and is now a brain in a jar, a robo-brain, without the conventional robotic chassis, running on preserved organic tissue in a laboratory that has kept him functional for over 2 centuries. Calvert is one of the franchise's most interesting examples of what extended life outside a functional body does to a person's psychology. He is intelligent, capable of complex planning, deeply resentful of everyone who still has a body, and absolutely certain that his centuries of existence have given him insights that shorter lived beings are incapable of. Whether he is actually wiser or simply more elaborate in his rationalizations, this is a question the DLC leaves open. He has had time to develop very sophisticated justifications for what he wants, and what he wants is not obviously benign. Honest Hearts and the Theology of Violence. The Honest Hearts DLC is built around Joshua Graham, but its deepest thematic concern is the question of whether there is a way to respond to violence that doesn't perpetuate it. This question is examined from multiple angles simultaneously, through multiple characters with genuinely different answers, and the DLC is honest enough not to pretend any of the answers is simply right. Joshua Graham's answer, at the point where players meet him, is provisional. He has spent years trying to separate his current life from his past as the Legion's legate, and he has had significant success. He has a community he is part of, relationships that have meaning, a purpose that is not organized around causing harm. But the Whiteleg's attack on New Canaan and pursuit of the survivors into Zion has put him back in a situation where his capacity for violence is, practically speaking, the most useful thing about him. And he knows that using his capacity for violence, even in defense of people he cares about, moves him back toward the person he spent years trying not to be. His answer to this tension is a faith-based one, that violence can be moral when it is proportionate, directed toward the protection of the innocent, and carried out without pleasure or hatred. This is in broad strokes a just war theory, and it is coherent as far as it goes. But his companion Daniel offers a different answer, that any engagement with violence, however justified, creates conditions for more violence, and that the survivors of New Canaan would be better served by leaving Zion entirely rather than fighting for it. Daniel's position is pacifist in its practical implications, even if not in its underlying theology, and it, too, is coherent. The player's choice between the positions, whether to stay and fight with Graham or to lead the Sorrows tribe out of Zion with Daniel, is one of the more genuinely meaningful choices in the franchise because it does not have an objectively correct answer. Both positions reflect genuine values. Both have genuine costs. Graham's approach will likely result in more deaths in the short term and possibly more lasting protection for the Zion communities. Daniel's approach will avoid the immediate violence, but abandon something. Zion itself, its sacred landscape, its meaning to the tribes that cannot be recovered. Whether the thing being abandoned is worth the violence required to protect it is a question about which reasonable people can disagree. What Honest Hearts does that few other pieces of the franchise manage is to make the religious dimension of these questions feel real rather than decorative. Graham's faith is not just character flavor, it is the actual framework through which he processes his experience, makes his decisions, and understands the meaning of what he has done and what he is doing. His references to Scripture are not performative piety. They are a person using the conceptual resources available to them to work through problems that don't have easy answers. Whether you share his theology or not, the way it functions in his life is entirely recognizable. The mystery of the Institute's fate. What comes after? The destruction of the Institute at the end of Fallout 4 leaves an enormous question unanswered. What happens now? The Institute was, for all its moral catastrophe, the most scientifically capable organization in the post-war East. Its bioscience division's work on agricultural adaptation and disease treatment had potential applications that could have meaningfully improved life in the Commonwealth. Its robotics research was centuries ahead of anything any other faction possessed. Its advanced systems division's teleportation technology if it survived the Institute's destruction in any usable form, represents a capability that has no equivalent anywhere in the wasteland. Some of this knowledge survived. The sole survivor, as the Institute's director in the Institute ending, or as the person who oversaw the evacuation in the railroad ending, had access to the Institute's databases and could theoretically have preserved significant portions of its research. The coursers, highly trained synths who served as the Institute's field operatives, scattered after the Institute's destruction, each carrying their own knowledge and capability. Some of the Institute's scientists, who were not all monsters and many of whom were primarily interested in their research rather than the Institute's political agenda, may have found ways to continue their work in new contexts, but most of it was lost. The Institute was built around the assumption of its own continuity, its research programs, its personnel training, its institutional memory, and the sudden destruction of the facility that housed all of this cannot be easily recovered from. The Commonwealth after the Institute's fall is a place where the most sophisticated science ever conducted in the post-war world has been interrupted, and the odds of it being resumed at the same level by any remaining actor are not good. This is the specific shape of the tragedy that Fallout 4's endings all carry, including the endings that feel most triumphant. You have done something real and significant. You have removed a source of genuine harm from the Commonwealth. And in doing so, you have also destroyed something that, if it had been possible to separate its harmful practices from its genuine capabilities, might have been one of the foundations of a functional post-war civilization. The game is honest that this is a loss. It doesn't dwell on it extensively because the narrative momentum of the ending doesn't allow for extended elegy. But it's there in the specific silence where the Institute used to be. Ghouls and the meaning of longevity, the franchise's treatment of ghoul longevity, is one of its most philosophically consistent threads. Every long-lived ghoul in the series, and there are many ranging from incidental NPCs to major characters like the ghoul in the TV show, carries a specific kind of psychological weight that the franchise is careful to represent honestly. Living for centuries when no one around you does is not straightforwardly a blessing. The human social world is built on the assumption of shared mortality, relationships, communities, institutions. These are all organized around the fact that the people who compose them will eventually die and be replaced. The grief of losing people you love, repeated over generations, without the comfort of knowing that you will eventually join them, is a specific kind of suffering that the franchise takes seriously. Ghouls lose everyone. Everyone they loved in their human lives, everyone they knew in the early post-war years, the people who helped them survive in the first decades after the bombs, the communities they built and watched decline and fall. The accumulation of loss, decade after decade, century after century, is not something that human psychology was designed to manage. What ghouls tend to do with this weight falls into a few recognizable patterns. Some develop a kind of resigned detachment, not coldness exactly, but a careful management of attachment, a learned reluctance to invest too deeply in any particular person or community because the investment will eventually be lost and the loss will hurt. The ghoul in the TV show exemplifies this pattern in his post-war persona, the calculated distance, the refusal to commit to anything longer than the immediate transaction, the deep suspicion of any narrative about the future that requires hope. He has been hurt by hope before, specifically and repeatedly, and he has learned to manage the hurt by not hoping. Others go in the opposite direction and become more intensely attached to the people and communities of the present than shorter-lived humans typically manage. Ghoul characters who have sustained their humanity over centuries sometimes display a kind of concentrated attention to the people around them that is almost supernatural, an intensity of presence that comes from knowing, from 200 years of experience, exactly how precious and exactly how temporary the connections of any given moment are. Harold in his grove has this quality. His conversation is unhurried, specific, attentive, in a way that suggests someone who has learned to be fully present, because the disengaged management of accumulated loss, is its own kind of death. The feral ghoul population is the shadow side of this longevity. Whatever neurological process maintains a ghoul's cognition and identity across centuries can apparently fail, and when it fails, the result is a creature that retains the physical resilience of a ghoul without the personality, the memories, or the capacity for meaningful social interaction. Feral ghouls are not dangerous because they chose to be. They're dangerous because the thing that made them human stopped functioning, and what's left is the survival instinct and the aggression that come with the physical transformation. Every feral ghoul was once a person, and the non-feral ghouls who encounter them know this. The franchise almost never makes this explicit. The games are not interested in the tragedy of feral ghoulification in the way that a novel might be, but it's present in the background of every encounter with a feral, if you choose to think about it. The Great War's longest shadow, generational trauma. The post war world of Fallout is a world organized around generational trauma in ways that the franchise sometimes addresses explicitly and sometimes simply lives in without naming. Every community in the wasteland was formed by people who survived something catastrophic, and those founding experiences shaped the community's cultures, institutions, and assumptions in ways that persist long after the original survivors are dead. Vault communities carry the specific trauma of enforced enclosure, the knowledge that survival required being locked in with no choice about the terms, no knowledge of what was happening outside, complete dependency on an institution that turned out to have its own agenda. This produces a particular relationship to authority and institutional trust that shows up throughout the franchise. Vault dwellers who emerge from functional, relatively benign vaults often have a default trust of institutional structures. They know what well run institutions look like, and their instinct is to look for the equivalent in the surface world. Vault dwellers who emerge from damaged or experimental vaults carry a specific and well founded paranoia about institutional claims on their well being. Surface communities carry different kinds of trauma. The generations who lived through the early post war years, the acute radiation, sickness, the famines, the violence of desperate people fighting over inadequate resources produced survivors with a very direct understanding of scarcity and a strong tendency to hoard. Their children and grandchildren inherited this tendency as cultural pattern even after conditions had improved sufficiently to make it no longer necessary. And the result is the specific kind of wasteland economy, barter based, heavily focused on immediate survival goods, deeply suspicious of abstractions like credit or long term investment, that characterizes most settlements. The communities that organized around military or paramilitary structures in the early post war years, the precursors to the Brotherhood chapters, the ranger groups that eventually became NCR Ranger Corps, the tribal militias, produced a specific kind of institutional culture organized around hierarchy, physical toughness, and the assumption that the primary function of any institution is defenses against external threat. This culture is adaptive in conditions of genuine threat and maladaptive in conditions of stability, which is one of the reasons why the Brotherhood's transformation from a defense and preservation organization to something more like a hegemonic military power was, from the inside, probably barely perceptible. The culture that produced the Brotherhood was already organized around the primacy of force, and the institutions that culture generated expressed that primacy more openly as they became more powerful. The franchise is interested in all of this without always being explicit about it, and the depth it provides comes partly from this interest in the residue that history leaves in institutions and communities. The wasteland is not populated by people who are simply responding to immediate conditions. It's populated by people carrying the weight of what happened to their grandparents and their grandparents' grandparents, organized into communities shaped by those weights, building institutions that express them. The cycle that the franchise keeps returning to, the way that each attempt to rebuild civilization ends up replicating the structures that destroyed the previous one, is not just a comment on human nature. It's a specific observation about how trauma and institutional culture interact to produce patterns that are very difficult to break. Breaking those patterns requires something that the franchise identifies in various characters across its history: the ability to see clearly what you are and where you came from and what that means for the choices you're making now. Joshua Graham has this. Nick Valentine has it in his own way. The Courier, at their best, has it. Lucy McLean is in the process of acquiring it. These characters don't break the cycle through heroic action, though some of them perform heroic actions. They break it through self knowledge, through the willingness to examine the assumptions their circumstances have given them and decide, one by one, which ones to keep and which ones to discard. This is quiet work. It doesn't make good propaganda or memorable monuments, but the franchise suggests, consistently and with increasing clarity across its history, that it's the only work that actually matters. The wasteland will be rebuilt, or it won't, depending on whether enough people do this quiet work in enough places at enough times. The franchise doesn't promise that they will. It just shows you what it looks like when they try. End of expansion content, the radio and the voice. Broadcasting. across the ruins. One of Fallout franchise's most distinctive and emotionally effective world-building choices is its use of radio. In a world where the communication infrastructure of the old world has collapsed, where there is no internet, no broadcast television, no satellite network, no reliable long-distance communications of any kind, radio is the most powerful mass medium available, and the people who control radio stations have a disproportionate influence on how the wasteland understands itself. Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3, hosted by Three Dog, is the Capital Wasteland's primary source of news, music, and community. Three Dog broadcasts from a converted building in the ruins of Washington, D.C., protected by a small Brotherhood garrison and run on power he is constantly struggling to maintain and extend. His signal range is limited. The Galaxy News is really more like the local district news, but within his range, his broadcasts are the closest thing. The Capital Wasteland has to shared cultural experience. He plays the same pre-war standards that appear throughout the franchise. He reports on events in the wasteland with the specific perspective of someone who has been observing it for years, and he keeps a running commentary on the activities of the game's protagonist that is simultaneously funny, affecting, and a little bit absurd as a piece of narrative framing. Free Dog is not a neutral broadcaster. He has strong opinions about the Enclave, about the Brotherhood, about the Project of Project Purity, about what the Capital Wasteland deserves and needs. His radio is advocacy journalism, delivered with the cadence of a DJ who knows exactly how long he has before his listeners' attention wanders. He is, in the specific context of the Capital Wasteland, one of the most politically significant people in the region, and the franchise is aware of this. His questline involves helping him extend his signal to reach more of the wasteland, and the question of why this matters is taken seriously. Mr. New Vegas, the radio host in Fallout. New Vegas is a different kind of broadcaster. Smooth, knowledgeable, slightly mysterious in origin, and genuinely neutral in a way that Three Dog deliberately is not. His voice is calm and pleasant, his commentary is dry and occasionally pointed, and his presence creates a specific kind of ambient texture for the Mojave experience that is almost meditative. You can play through long stretches of New Vegas without paying close attention to Mr. New Vegas and still be affected by his presence. The quality of calm he brings to what is otherwise a very tense game world is not accidental. He is the sound of a world that has made a certain kind of peace with what it is. Diamond City Radio in Fallout 4, as mentioned in the earlier section on culture, features Travis Miles, whose character arc from stuttering anxiety to genuine public presence mirrors the player character's own arc of moving from the private grief of the sole survivor to engagement with the Commonwealth's larger social world. Travis's growth is validated by his audience's response. The people of Diamond City begin taking him more seriously as he takes himself more seriously, and the radio station becomes more than background noise. It becomes community. All three of these radio stations share a common function that goes beyond entertainment or information. They make the wasteland smaller. They create the sense that the events in one part of the region are connected to events in other parts, that there is a shared narrative of which individual experiences are chapters. This sense of shared narrative is one of the foundations of any community larger than a single settlement, and in a world where physical connection is slow and dangerous and often impossible, radio is the primary technology for maintaining it. The people who control the radio don't just report the story. They help create it by choosing what to report and how, by giving shape and meaning to events that would otherwise be isolated incidents without context. The Enclave remnants. What survives defeat the Enclave veterans who appear in Fallout? New Vegas represents something the franchise rarely shows: the human beings inside an institution after the institution has been destroyed. They have lost everything the Enclave promised them: the sense of purpose, the institutional identity, the certainty that they were the right people for the job of remaking the world. What they have left is themselves, and the game is interested in what that amounts to. Arcade Gannon is the most developed of the Enclave survivors encountered in New Vegas. He is a doctor, trained by the followers of the Apocalypse, working in Freeside's medical clinic. He is also the son of an Enclave officer, raised among the Enclave remnants after the defeats in Fallout 2, and he has spent his adult life trying to maintain some separation between who he is now and where he comes from. This is not entirely successful. He is aware that the skills he has, the education he received, the specific combination of knowledge and capability that makes him valuable as a doctor are products of the institutional world he is trying to distance himself from. The Enclave trained its people well. Arcade is well trained. These facts coexist in him with discomfort that never quite resolves. His companion quest for Auld Lang Syne involves finding the surviving Enclave veterans and persuading them to fight one last battle in defense of the Mojave. The question it asks is not whether the Enclave was good or bad. Both Arcade and the player already know the answer to that, but whether people who served a bad institution can be redeemed by how they choose to use what that institution gave them. The veterans he finds are old and tired and have been living quiet lives in their retirement from the world that rejected them. Whether they will stand up one more time and for what and whether it matters is what the quest resolves. The answer the quest arrives at that the veterans will fight, that they still have something worth offering, that their skills and their willingness to deploy them in the right cause counts for something even after everything that came before, is genuinely moving without being sentimental. The game doesn't clean their hands or erase their histories. It just shows that people are more than the institutions they served, and that service in the wrong institution for the wrong ends doesn't permanently foreclose the possibility of doing something right. The Deathclaw as mirror. The Deathclaw holds a specific place in the franchise's symbolic vocabulary that is worth naming explicitly. It is the thing that the pre-war military made, the creature designed to be the ultimate weapon of the American state, and 2 centuries later, it is one of the most successful apex predators in the post-war ecosystem, entirely outside human control and very much its own thing. It is in this sense a perfect emblem of the franchise's central argument about the relationship between creation and creator. The pre-war military created Deathclaws to be weapons. What the Deathclaws became in 2 centuries of free evolution is a species, a social species, with family structures and territorial behavior and the kinds of intraspecies communication that develop in social animals. They didn't become what they were made to be. They became what the conditions of their existence shaped them into being, and those conditions were the conditions of the post-war wasteland rather than the conditions of a military training program. The weapon became an animal. The instrument became a creature. This transformation is in the franchise's moral geography, a kind of liberation. The Deathclaw that guards its nest in Fallout 4 is not serving anyone's agenda. It is not following its creator's instructions. It is doing what its nature and its circumstances and the needs of its family require it to do, and it is in this sense free, in a way that no creature designed purely as a tool can be free. The horror of encountering a Deathclaw in the wasteland is real, and the games don't soften it. But the franchise is also interested in what the Deathclaw represents beyond its immediate threat value. And what it represents is the failure of the instrumentalization of living things. You can make a creature into a weapon. You cannot prevent it from eventually becoming something else. The water question, purity, scarcity, and power water runs through the Fallout franchise as both a practical resource and a persistent symbol. Clean water is the single most important resource in the post-war world, more important than food, more important than weapons, more important in many respects than knowledge. Without clean water, settlements die. With reliable access to it, settlements grow. The control of water is the control of life, and every major power in the franchise's various settings has a specific relationship to water that reflects its broader values and power structure. Project Purity in Fallout 3 is built around the idea that clean water, made universally available, is the foundation of post-war recovery. James, the player character's father, dedicated his life to this project, and the game frames his dedication as both admirable and, as in certain respects, naive. The assumption that access to clean water will automatically lead to better outcomes depends on there being social and institutional structures capable of distributing it fairly and preventing its control from being captured by whoever holds the most guns. The Enclave's attempt to contaminate Project Purity's water supply is the game's central conflict, precisely because it makes visible what pure technical solutions without political solutions actually look like, a tool waiting to be captured by whoever gets there first. The water merchants of the hub in the original Fallout are a much more cynical version of the same dynamic. Clean water is extraordinarily valuable, and those who control access to it wield significant power over communities that need it. The hub's water merchants are not villains in the traditional sense. They provide a service that the wasteland genuinely needs, but their control over access to clean water creates the conditions for the kind of extraction and dependency that the franchise consistently treats as one of the primary mechanisms of post-war inequality. New Vegas's relationship to water is shaped almost
Yeah.
entirely by Hoover Dam, which is the reason both the NCR and Caesar's Legion want to control the Mojave. The dam generates electricity, which is extraordinarily valuable, but it also manages water flow in the Colorado River Basin, which is the water supply for an enormous region. Control of the dam is control of the water, and control of the water is, in the long run, control of everything. Mr. House understands this. The NCR understands this. Caesar understands this. The difference between them is what they plan to do with control once they have it. Good Springs and the pedagogy of beginning Good Springs, the small Mojave town where Fallout, New Vegas begins, is one of the more elegant tutorial environments in RPG history. Partly because it functions as a genuine community rather than a set of game mechanics dressed in fictional clothing. The town has a population, an economy, a history, and ongoing problems that exist independently of the courier's presence. The powder gangers who menaced the town were a real threat before the courier arrived and would continue to be a real threat if the courier left without intervening. The choice the game offers early, whether to help the town defend itself against the powder gangers or to aid the powder, gangers in crushing the town is not presented as a moral test in the explicit way that some RPG games present early choices. It's presented as a practical situation with two possible outcomes, and the game is interested in which of those outcomes the player finds more natural. Most players help the town. Some help the powder gangers out of curiosity or a desire to see the alternative, or a genuine belief that the powder gangers represent something worth supporting. The game accommodates all of these choices without judging them. What Good Springs teaches, what every opening town in the Fallout franchise teaches, in different ways, is that the wasteland is a place where decisions have consequences that affect people beyond yourself. The courier who helps Good Springs survives and gains allies and leaves behind a town that is slightly more capable of defending itself than it was before. The courier who helps the powder ganger survives and gains different allies and leaves behind a town that has been damaged or destroyed or brought under the domination of a criminal gang. Neither outcome changes the fundamental shape of the Mojave, but both outcomes are real, and the people of Good Springs are real. And what happens to them matters even if it doesn't matter to the history of the Hoover Dam conflict. This is the franchise's most persistent lesson, offered from the very beginning of every game it has produced. The large historical questions are important, but the small human questions are also important, and the relationship between them is not as hierarchical as it might appear. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam will determine the future of the Western Wasteland. The fate of Good Springs will determine the fate of Good Springs. Both of these things are real. Both of them deserve attention. The courier, who treats Good Springs as merely a tutorial space to be completed and discarded on the way to the main plot, is missing something that the game is trying to show them. The television show and the future of the lore, the Amazon Prime Video Fallout television series, which premiered in April 2024, represents the most significant expansion of the franchise's lore since the release of Fallout 4 in 2015. Its status as fully canon, confirmed by both Bethesda and the show's creators, means that everything it establishes about the pre-war world, about the immediate causes of the Great War, about the fate of the NCR and the West Coast, about the specific characters and institutions that have shaped the Wasteland's 2296 present, is now part of the permanent record of the franchise's universe. The show's most immediate contribution to the lore is its portrait of the pre-war world in specific and human terms. Previous games had given us the pre-war world through artifacts, recordings, and ruins. The show gives us actual people in that world, with actual relationships and actual choices to make. Barb Howard, Vault-Tec's executive, is not a monster in the conventional sense. She is a person who has convinced herself that what she is doing is necessary and good, who has the specific quality of total institutional commitment that makes people capable of participating in monstrous projects without experiencing them as monstrous. Hank McLean, her assistant and later her ideological heir, is the same type. A company man who believes in the company, who has made the company's purposes his own purposes, who is incapable of evaluating those purposes from outside them. Cooper Howard, the pre-war actor who becomes the Ghoul, is the show's most effective vehicle for examining what was lost in the Great War. He was, before the war, a person with a life, a marriage, a child, a career, a specific place in a specific moment of history. The show's flashbacks to his pre-war life are among the most carefully observed pieces of pre-war world-building in the franchise, using the specificity of his individual circumstances. The bourbon commercial he's filming, the conversation with his wife about Vault-Tec, the afternoon with his daughter at a Vault-Tec promotional event to make the pre-war world feel lived in rather than merely described. Season two's movement toward New Vegas, confirmed by the season one finale's final shot of the iconic skyline, promises to bring the show into direct contact with the lore that New Vegas established about the West Coast in the years following 2281, what the NCR's fate looks like up close, what the Mojave's power structure became after the Second Battle of Hoover Dam, whether the show will canonize one of New Vegas's endings or take a different approach to the question. The showrunners have been deliberately cagey about this, suggesting they're aware of the lore implications and taking them seriously. Whatever they decide will shape the franchise's universe in permanent ways, and the community's intense engagement with that question reflects fled how deeply the franchise's fans have invested in the world it has built. The franchise's future, beyond the immediate horizon of Season 2, includes a Fallout 5 that Bethesda is committed to producing at some point after The Elder Scrolls 6. The long gap between Fallout 4 and whatever comes next, probably more than a decade when all is said and done, means that Fallout 5 will arrive in a world where the show has established significant new lore, where players' expectations have been shaped by the Amazon series version of the universe, and where the question of what comes after the events of Season 2 has been at least partially answered. The show and the games are now in genuine creative dialogue with each other, and the franchise that emerges from that dialogue will be richer and stranger and more complicated than either medium could have produced alone. What that franchise will continue to do, if it is true to what has made it significant, is ask the same questions it has always asked. Whether civilization is worth rebuilding, whether the people who broke it have any right to shape what comes next, whether the cycle of institutional arrogance and catastrophic failure can be interrupted, or whether it is the permanent condition of organized human life, whether individual choices made in specific moments by specific people in specific circumstances can add up to something that changes the direction of history. These are not questions with permanent answers. They're questions that need to be asked in every generation, in every context, by every person who has enough awareness to ask them. The Fallout universe asks them in the specific context of a world that ended and kept going, a world where the evidence of catastrophic failure is literally everywhere you look, and people are nonetheless trying. That specificity, that commitment to asking the hard questions in a world where the stakes of getting the answers wrong are fully visible, is what has made the franchise matter to the people who love it, and what will keep it mattering as long as it keeps asking. The nuclear fire went out over 2 centuries ago. The work of figuring out what comes after it is still ongoing. It will be ongoing for a long time yet, and that in the end is the entire lore of Fallout. If you made it this far, through the pre-war boardrooms and the sealed vault doors, through the wasteland's creatures and its communities and its centuries of accumulated history, then you know this universe as well as it can be known from the outside side. You've walked alongside the Vault Dweller and the Chosen One and the Lone Wanderer and the Courier and the Sole Survivor, and the Vault 76 Dwellers and Lucy McLean. You've met the Master and Caesar and Mr. House and Father and Joshua Graham and Harold. You've been to California and Nevada and the Capital Wasteland and the Commonwealth and Appalachia and the swamps of Maryland and the canyons of Utah and the irradiated island off the coast of Maine. The Wasteland thanks you. Go rest. Subscribe if you want to come back. There is always more to find.